Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. I strolled down my driveway to the mailbox, just like any other day. Flipped open the little metal latch and pulled out the usual stack of mail bills. Some junk mail, a magazine, nothing special. But as I was thumbing through the pile on my way back to the house, one envelope caught my eye. It was kinda beat up, with handwriting that looked elegant but shaky, like an old person's. My name, Ethan Hayes, and address were scrawled on it in blue ink. In the top left corner, there was a return address I didn't recognize. Naturally, I got curious. I picked up my pace, went inside, and closed the door behind me. I headed straight for the kitchen table and tossed the rest of the mail aside. This one envelope had my full attention. The return address said it was from some law firm in a town about 2 hours away, a place called Oakhaven. I tore open the flap and pulled out a folded letter. As I unfolded it and started to read, I could hardly believe my eyes. "Dear Mr. Ethan Hayes," it began, "we hope this letter finds you well. We are writing to inform you of a matter of significant importance concerning the last will and testament of your great-uncle, Mr. Arthur Hayes." My great-uncle. I didn't even know I had a great-uncle Arthur. The letter went on. "It seems that Miss Hayes has named you as the sole beneficiary of a property he owned. The property in question is a cabin located in a remote area specified as Parcel 92, Forest Glade County. Enclosed are directions and a map for your reference. A cabin in the middle of nowhere." This was getting weirder by the second. "According to the will, you are granted full ownership and rights to this cabin, effective immediately upon your receipt of this letter." I continued reading. "We understand that you may not have been aware of your relationship with Mr. Arthur Hayes, but the documents are clear in naming you as the inheritor. As his only surviving relative, the property now rightfully belongs to you. The letter advised me to visit the property to check it out and figure out what I wanted to do with it. It also said I could call them if I had any questions. It was signed by a Robert D. Campbell, senior partner at Campbell and Associates law firm. There was even a PSS. "We recommend exercising caution if you decide to visit the cabin. It is situated in a fairly remote and uncharted area." That part gave me a bit of a chill, not gonna lie. After I finished the letter, I unfolded the map they sent. It was one of those topographical maps showing all the hills, valleys, rivers, and forests. It was mostly shades of green and brown. There was a red circle drawn around what I guessed was the cabin's location. It was deep in the forest, far from any main road. I saw some lines that looked like trails or maybe old logging roads leading to it, but they were super winding and complicated. And the nearest town, Willow Creek, was a good distance away. This place was seriously remote, just like the letter said. I sat back and thought about what I was getting myself into. I'd need to be prepared, and that exercise caution part kept nagging at me. But despite the uncertainty and a growing sense of unease, my curiosity was winning. I had to see this mysterious cabin for myself. I grabbed a notepad and started jotting down what I'd need for the trip, all while keeping an eye on that red circle on the map. Later, I loaded my bags into my car, double-checking to make sure I had all the essentials: food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my camera. I was feeling a mix of excitement and, honestly, a little bit of dread. I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway. The first part of the drive was pretty boring, just passing through familiar towns and along highways I'd driven on a million times. But as I got closer to the area marked on the map, things started to change. The road got narrower, the houses became fewer and farther between. Soon, I was on this winding road that cut through a thick forest. The trees were huge, their leaves making a canopy overhead that turned the sunlight into these dancing patterns on the road. Then I turned onto an even narrower road, more like a dirt track, really. My car was bumping all over the place on the uneven surface. I could hear the sound of running water nearby, probably a stream or something. Birds were chirping, but other than that, it was eerily quiet. No traffic, no hum of electricity, just nature. After what felt like forever, I finally saw it, the cabin. It was partly hidden by tall trees and overgrown bushes. It was old, that was for sure. As I got closer, I could hear the crunch of my tires on the gravel path leading up to it. The whole place was surrounded by nature, like really surrounded. Tall trees with thick trunks were everywhere, their leaves rustling softly in the wind. There were overgrown bushes and wildflowers adding splashes of color to all the green. The forest floor was covered in fallen leaves, pine cones, and patches of moss. The cabin itself looked kinda charming but also tough, like it had been there forever. It was made of weathered wood, all gray and worn. The roof was sloped and covered in wooden shingles. There was a small front porch with an old rocking chair, and I could see faded curtains in the windows. It was just one story, not big at all, but it somehow fit right in with the whole wild setting. As I got out of the car, I took a look around at the wider area. In the distance, I could see mountains, their peaks kinda hazy. Between the cabin and the mountains, there was just this huge forest that seemed to go on forever, a sea of trees and rolling hills. I didn't see any lakes or rivers close by, but the air smelled damp and earthy, like there was water somewhere nearby. I stood there for a minute, just taking it all in. The place was beautiful, no doubt about it, but it also felt super remote, almost isolating. It was like stepping back in time. I found the key under a loose board on the porch, just like the instructions said. I put it in the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing the inside of the cabin. As I stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was how much the inside of the cabin felt like the outside, old, but like, well, maintained old. The air was musty, but not in a gross way, more like aged wood and old paper. The first room seemed to be a combo living and dining area. There was a wooden table with 4 chairs, and a rustic-looking sofa facing a stone fireplace. The walls had these paintings of forest scenes, and there were a few odd knick-knacks on the mantel above the fireplace, little carved statues, some old books, and a vintage clock that wasn't ticking. I walked further into the cabin, my footsteps echoing a bit on the hardwood floor. To the right of the living area was a small kitchen. It was pretty basic, with wooden cabinets and a gas stove. The countertops were empty except for a few utensils and an old coffee pot. There was a small window above the sink that looked out into the forest. Next, I found a door that led to a bedroom. It had a double bed covered in a quilt that looked handmade, and an old wooden dresser against one wall. There was a faded photograph in a tarnished frame on top of the dresser. Another door in the bedroom opened into a tiny bathroom. Just the basic toilet, sink, and a stand-up shower. The tiles were old but clean, and the faucet looked like it had seen better days. Finally, I discovered what looked like a study, or maybe a small library. A wooden desk was crammed in there, covered with papers, pens, and more of those weird, shaped artifacts. A bookshelf lined one wall, packed with books that ranged from beat up old novels to thick volumes that looked like journals. This room felt different, more personal, like this was where my great-uncle, Arthur, spent most of his time. I made my way back to the living area, taking another look at the paintings and those strange objects on the mantel. Then my eyes landed on a small cabinet next to the fireplace that I hadn't noticed before. It looked like it might have something interesting inside. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over and opened its wooden door. Inside, I found a stack of journals, all bound in worn leather. Pulling one out, I saw the name, Arthur Hayes, written on the first page. These must have been his journals. I grabbed a couple of them and headed over to the sofa. Sitting down, I placed them on the coffee table in front of me. I opened the first journal to a random page and started reading. And wow, what I found was both fascinating and seriously unsettling. Arthur wrote about the forest and the cabin, sure, but he also talked about these mysterious forces and strange things that happened. He mentioned hearing whispers in the wind and seeing shadows moving in ways that weren't natural. He described times when he felt watched, even when he was inside the cabin. Moving on to the second journal, I found sketches of bizarre symbols and what looked like ritualistic objects. He wrote about entities that lived in the forest, guardians or spirits of some kind. The writing got more frantic as the pages went on, almost like he was in a hurry to get it all down. I sat back, my mind racing. What was Arthur involved in? And why did he leave all of this to me? A wave of unease washed over me, replacing the initial excitement. These weren't just the ramblings of an old man, they felt like warnings. I looked around the cabin, suddenly very aware of how isolated it was. I remembered that line in the letter about exercising caution. And for the first time since I got there, I wondered if coming here alone was such a good idea. I closed the journals and put them back on the table, my head spinning. I glanced out the window and noticed that the sky was starting to get dark. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. I realized I'd lost track of time while reading the journals. It was time to get settled in for the night. I went to the kitchen and unpacked some of the food I'd brought. After a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the stove, I washed up and then went around locking up the cabin. I double-checked the windows and doors, feeling a need for extra caution after what I'd read in Arthur's journals. Next, I headed to the bedroom to get ready for bed. The bed was old but seemed comfy enough. I unfolded a set of sheets and a blanket from my bag and made the bed as best as I could. The room felt quiet, almost too quiet, but I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had been growing since I read those journals. Finally, I switched off the lights and lay down, pulling the blanket up to my chin. Despite my racing thoughts, I felt the exhaustion of the day catching up with me. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the fading embers in the fireplace, and the soft glow of the moon through the curtains. As I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but think about the mysterious world that Arthur wrote about. But right now, I needed rest. Whatever questions and uncertainties I had would have to wait until morning. Within minutes, I drifted off to sleep, the sounds of the forest acting like some kind of weird, natural lullaby. I woke up early the next morning, blinking as the first rays of sun started to filter through the worn curtains. Last night's events weighed heavily on my mind. Arthur's unsettling journals, the weird noises, that feeling of being watched. But instead of scaring me off, these mysteries were only making me more curious. It was like the forest was calling to me, daring me to uncover its secrets. After getting dressed, I laced up my hiking boots, making sure they were good and snug. I packed my backpack with essentials, a couple bottles of water, a map of the area, and a flashlight, just in case. I slung my camera around my neck and stepped out of the cabin, locking the door behind me. The forest, bathed in morning light, looked different from the previous evening, but no less intimidating. Birds were singing, but their sounds were muffled, as if even they were cautious about breaking the forest's solemn silence. With the map in hand, I ventured deeper into the woods. My boots crunched on the mixture of soil and fallen leaves. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that the forest was a living thing, watching my every move. As I walked, I kept checking the map, making sure I wasn't straying too far from the cabin. And then I saw them, the symbols, carved into the trunks of trees, etched onto rocks half buried in the earth. They were all sharp angles and lines, intersecting in ways that seemed both random and deliberate. I remembered Arthur's sketches in his journal. Eager to document what I was seeing, I pulled out my camera and started snapping pictures. I took shots of the symbols from different angles, and even a few of the surrounding area, trying to capture the whole scene. As I went deeper into the forest, the atmosphere shifted, subtly but definitely. The air felt thicker, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath my feet seemed less welcoming. It was like I was trespassing, entering a space where humans weren't meant to be. Then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, where the sunlight barely reached through the dense canopy of leaves. As I stepped into the clearing, my eyes were immediately drawn to a scattering of bones. They lay there, bleached white against the dark earth. I looked closer and realized they were animal bones, probably from a deer or something. But this wasn't the work of a predator. The bones were arranged, deliberately placed, in a way that suggested intention, like some kind of ritual. In the center, a skull rested on a flat stone, its hollow eye socket staring up at me. The whole thing gave off a seriously menacing vibe, like a makeshift altar. A chill ran down my spine, turning into a cascade of icy shivers. My heart was racing, and that feeling of unease that had been growing since I found those symbols reached a whole new level. I stood there for a few moments, frozen, debating what to do. The rational part of me was screaming to get out, to leave this place and never look back. But another part, the part that had been reading Arthur's journals, looking at his sketches, and absorbing his warnings, wanted to dig deeper. There were too many unanswered questions, too many bizarre things happening that demanded an explanation. Finally, I made my decision. As much as the sight in front of me screamed, danger, my desire for answers won out. I carefully stepped out of the clearing, making sure not to disturb the bone arrangement. With a deep breath, I turned my back to it and started heading back toward the cabin. My pace was quicker now, fueled by a mix of dread and urgency. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was closing in, that its eyes were on me. But the need to understand what was going on here kept me moving. As I approached the cabin, my emotions were all over the place. I was filled with both anticipation and dread, knowing that whatever answers I found might not be the ones I wanted. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, feeling the weight of the cabin's atmosphere settle around me. As the sky outside darkened and night fell over the forest, the atmosphere inside the cabin changed. The walls seemed to close in a little, and every creak of the wood made me jump. It wasn't long before I started hearing noises that were different from the usual sounds of a forest at night. It wasn't just crickets or the hoot of an owl. I heard whispers, too faint to be words but too rhythmic to be random. There was rustling in the bushes, not the kind you'd expect from small animals. And then there was the occasional, unmistakable snap of a twig breaking under weight. I tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was just the wind or some nocturnal animals. But deep down, I knew it was neither of those things. The sounds had a pattern, a deliberateness that was too intentional to be natural. My hands trembled as I pulled the curtains aside and looked out the window, half expecting to see something or someone staring back at me. The night outside was pitch black, the trees just silhouettes against the dark sky. I squinted, trying to focus, but I couldn't make out any details. But that didn't make the feeling of being watched go away. In fact, it intensified it. It was like the forest had come alive, aware of my presence, my curiosity, and my fears. I could almost feel eyes on me, unseen but definitely there, watching me from the darkness beyond the glass. My heart was pounding in my chest as I let the curtain fall back into place. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. Instead, it felt like it had seeped through the walls of the cabin, filling the space around me. I knew I wasn't alone, and the realization sent another chill down my spine. Picking up where I left off in Arthur's journal, I became totally engrossed in his detailed accounts. The pages were filled with observations about the woods, the strange sounds, and his growing sense that the forest was alive in a way most people would never understand. Unseen entities, he wrote, occupy these lands, older than the forest itself, older than human comprehension. He went on to describe his attempts to communicate with these entities. He'd spent nights sitting in the darkness, listening intently, even trying to mimic the sounds he heard. He believed that the sounds weren't random, but a form of language, complex and nuanced. It's as if they are speaking, discussing, deliberating about matters unfathomable to us, he noted. I've tried recording the sounds, even played them back. The recordings capture the noise but miss the essence. It's an experience that demands to be lived, not captured. Arthur also delved into the phenomena he observed in the forest, the orbs of light floating between trees, the sudden temperature drops in certain areas, and the disturbing discovery of animal remains, much like what I'd seen earlier. These entities are not evil, he wrote, but operate on a different ethical plane. The animals, I suspect, are not victims but participants in a cycle that's beyond my grasp. Reading this, a shiver went down my spine. It felt like Arthur was narrating my own experience, albeit from a different time. He spoke of being watched, of sensing that his presence was known, and perhaps even expected. I am not a visitor, he concluded in one entry. I'm a part of this now, linked to the forest and its unseen inhabitants in a way that defies easy explanation. Bah! As I was reading, I suddenly heard a soft thud from outside, followed by what sounded like footsteps on the porch. My eyes darted to the window, then to the door. The sounds were deliberate, too methodical to be an animal. My heart was racing as I carefully got up and moved toward the door. I pressed my ear against it, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to have stopped, replaced by a soft, indistinct murmuring that sent shivers down my spine. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I grabbed the flashlight from the table and slowly unlocked the door. I swung it open, pointing the flashlight beam into the blackness of the night. There was no one there. I scanned the trees in the surrounding area, but saw nothing. Just when I was about to convince myself that it was all in my head, the flashlight flickered and went out. Panic surged through me, and then, just as quickly, the light came back on. And that's when I saw it carved into the wooden frame of the porch was a new symbol, one I hadn't seen before. I quickly stepped back inside and locked the door, my mind racing faster than my heartbeat. Whoever, or whatever, was out there wasn't just passing by. It had left a message. I made sure the cabin door was locked and the windows securely fastened. I even moved a heavy chair against the door as an added precaution. Then, I grabbed the flashlight and kept it close, just in case the power failed. It was going to be a long night. For hours, the sounds continued, whispers growing louder, rustling leaves sounding more purposeful, and new noises joining the unsettling chorus. Despite my best efforts to stay calm, my nerves were frayed. Every little sound inside the cabin became amplified in the silence between the outdoor noises, making me jump at shadows. Finally, the first rays of morning light started to filter through the curtains. The noises outside gradually diminished, as if the forest was retreating, giving way to the dawn. I let out a sigh of relief, realizing I'd made it through the night. But what I'd experienced had left me with more questions than answers. After a day that felt strangely normal, considering it was now my third night in this cabin, and the feeling that something was off hadn't left me. The sun had set, and its absence cast long, dark shadows that stretched across the cabin's wooden walls. Those unsettling noises, the whispers and rustling that filled the air, were back as soon as the last rays of sunlight vanished. But tonight was different. Tonight I felt like I had to confront whatever was out there. I zipped up my jacket, making sure my flashlight was working, and headed for the door. As I stepped outside, the night air felt colder than before, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My flashlight beam cut a path through the darkness, revealing gnarled tree trunks and bushes that seemed to quiver at the unnatural sounds surrounding me. It wasn't just the wind rustling leaves or the distant hoot of an owl that I heard. Interwoven with those typical nighttime sounds were other noises that were clearly out of place. They were the whispers that didn't belong, the sounds Arthur described in his journals. I proceeded cautiously, my footsteps soft on the forest floor. Every now and then, my flashlight beam caught something, a strange mark on a tree, a sudden movement in the bushes that made my heart skip a beat. I realized I was venturing into the unknown, into a space that Arthur himself tried to understand but ultimately couldn't. As I went deeper into the woods, my flashlight beam scanned the surroundings with increasing speed. Each tree I passed seemed like a potential hiding spot for whatever it was that had been haunting this place. Suddenly, the air around me felt much colder, as if I'd stepped into an invisible bubble where the temperature had dropped significantly. Arthur mentioned temperature fluctuations in his journals, and now I was experiencing it firsthand. Before I could fully process this, an orb of light flickered in the distance, just a few yards away. It wasn't like any firefly or natural luminescence I'd ever seen. This light had an almost ethereal quality, as if it wasn't of this world. It appeared and disappeared in a split second. Then, cutting through the heavy silence, I heard a low growl. Instinctively, I aimed my flashlight in the direction of the noise. My light caught something, two glowing eyes staring back at me. But these weren't the eyes of a wolf, a bear, or any animal I knew. They were different. They were large, almost human-like, but the glow emanating from them was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The color wasn't just a simple yellow or red. It was a swirling mixture of colors that defied description. The moment felt like an eternity. Fear coursed through me, but so did awe. This was what Arthur had tried to document, the unseen entities that he believed existed in these woods. In this instant, time felt irrelevant. I was caught in a moment that made me understand how outmatched, how unprepared I was to delve any deeper into the mysteries surrounding this cabin in the forest. Realization washed over I wasn't equipped for this. The cabin, the forest, and especially this entity, whatever it was, were part of a world that I wasn't ready to engage with. With adrenaline pulsating through my veins, I turned and ran back toward the cabin, not daring to look back. I sprinted through the dark forest, my flashlight bobbing up and down as I dodged roots and branches. The cabin came into view, looking both inviting and ominous in the dark. I raced up the steps, burst through the front door, and slammed it shut behind me, immediately locking it. My hands trembled as I leaned against the door for support, my heart pounding in my chest. Questions whirled through my mind. Did that really happen? Can what I saw be explained away? A logical part of me wanted to rationalize it, to attribute it to wildlife, shadows, or simple imagination. But in the pit of my stomach, I knew it was none of those things. Gathering myself, I sat back down at the wooden table where Arthur's journals were still spread out. The feeling was surreal. The journals almost seemed to taunt me, filled as they were with Arthur's frantic words and sketches, his own attempts to comprehend the incomprehensible. The emotion I felt was a mirror of what Arthur must have felt, a combination of fear and a strange sense of awe. I surveyed the cabin, its worn wooden walls, the old furniture, and the peculiar artifacts that adorned it. This place, a legacy from a man I never knew, had pulled me into a realm that challenged everything I thought I understood. It had become apparent that staying was not an option. Finally, I made my way to the bedroom, each step heavy with the gravity of my decision. The bed creaked in protest as I lay down, pulling the blanket tightly around me. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, it dawned on me that this chapter of my life would close as suddenly as it opened. I'd pack up and leave at first light, abandoning this mysterious inheritance that had both intrigued and terrified me. I woke up to the chirping of birds, a sound that was disarmingly normal compared to the unsettling noises that had filled the air last night. Daylight filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow on the wooden interior of the cabin. For a moment, it was almost easy to forget the series of strange and terrifying events that had led me to this point. But as I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, the memories flooded back. With a sense of finality, I began packing up my things, the clothes, the camera, the first aid kit, and the half-empty bottles of water. Each item felt heavy with the weight of the decision I was about to make. I glanced over at Arthur's journals, still piled on the table, their worn pages filled with accounts of inexplicable occurrences and unknown entities. For a moment, I was tempted to grab them, to take them with me and continue trying to unravel the mysteries they contained. But then, I thought better of it. Some questions, I realized, are better left unanswered. As I zipped up my bag and hoisted it over my shoulder, I took one final look around the cabin. The old photographs on the wall, the rustic furniture, and even the little trinkets and artifacts that I assumed were part of Arthur's collection. All these things now felt like pieces of a puzzle I'd never complete. I walked over to the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of the forest. For a brief moment, I hesitated, looking back at the cabin as if expecting it to offer some kind of closure. But it just stood there, silent and inscrutable, as much a mystery now as it was when I first arrived. Finally, I turned away and headed for my car, parked a short distance away. I tossed my bag in the back seat and got into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, my hands trembled slightly, still shaken from last night's encounter. With a deep breath, I shifted into drive and started down the winding road that led away from the cabin. As the trees rushed by, I caught a final glimpse of the cabin in my rearview mirror. It receded into the distance, slowly fading from view, but I knew it would never fade from my memory. A mix of emotions filled me as I drove away: relief, certainly, but also a deep sense of regret. I might be leaving, but the questions, the mysteries, they were coming with me, tucked away in a corner of my mind, where they'd probably reside forever. Though I didn't find any answers, I touched something beyond normal human experience. And while I still don't know what that entity was, or why it exists, the experience has left an indelible mark on me. I may never understand this mysterious part of my family history, but maybe, just maybe, that's for the best. Some mysteries, I concluded, are better left unsolved. I'm Joey in my life, not exactly a fairy tale. Working the graveyard shift as a janitor at the old Greystone Tower wasn't how I pictured my life after high school. I was supposed to be this big, shot artist, painting amazing landscapes, getting my stuff in galleries, the whole 9 yards. But life, as it always does, threw me a curveball. A few bad calls, a couple of crappy events, and boom, I'm stuck in this creepy, old building with a mop and bucket for company. Honestly, the solitude of the job was a mixed bag. On one hand, it was peaceful. No judgy eyes, no drama. Just the buzz of the fluorescent lights and the groans of the building settling like an old man in his favorite armchair. But on the other hand, it gave me way too much time to think. And let me tell you, the regrets, the mistakes, they all came flooding back in the dead of night. But hey, I'd made my peace with it, mostly. Greystone Tower was a dinosaur, a relic from the days when Art Deco was all the rage. Its fancy patterns and huge lobby were like whispers of a glamorous past, now faded and dusty. These days, the place was practically a ghost town. A few small businesses clung to life inside, like they were holding on to a memory. By the time my shift started at 10 p.m., the building was empty. I liked to think of it as my own private urban ghost town, and I was the mayor, or maybe the sheriff. My routine. Same old, same old. Start on the ground floor, work my way up. Sweep, mop, empty trash, repeat. It was mind-numbing, yeah, but also kind of comforting. Each floor had its own vibe. The second floor always smelled like burnt coffee, thanks to the accounting firm's stressed out staff, no doubt. The fifth floor had this one squeaky tile near the men's room that made me jump every single time, no matter how often I stepped on it. And then there was the ninth floor. That floor was always colder, like someone left a window open, even in the middle of summer. It was on one of those typical, boring nights that I first saw it, the out of order elevator. I'd walked past it a million times, but this time, something about it snagged my attention. Maybe it was the way the light from the elevator shaft flickered, casting these weird shadows. Or maybe it was the piece of paper taped to its rusty, dented doors. I stopped mopping, my curiosity piqued. The paper was old and yellow, the edges all curled up. The handwriting was neat but kind of shaky, like whoever wrote it was in a hurry. The words were simple, but they hit me like a punch to the gut. 1. Only ride the elevator at exactly 3 a.m. 2. Never press the button for the 13th floor. 3. Do not look at your reflection in the elevator doors. 4. If the elevator stops and someone gets in, do not speak to them. 5. If you hear humming, exit the elevator immediately. 6. Never under any circumstances ride the elevator twice in one night. I frowned, reading the list again. It sounded like something out of a cheesy horror movie or a campfire story. I even chuckled nervously, glancing around like I expected someone to pop out and yell, "Boo." But the hallway was empty, and the building was silent, except for the hum of the AC. That elevator had been out of order for as long as I could remember. Nobody used it. Everyone just used the newer one, which was all shiny and modern. This old thing was just a forgotten piece of the building's past. Still, that list of rules, it bugged me. It wasn't just what it said, but how it was written. Like the person who wrote it genuinely believed every word. I tried to tell myself it was just a prank, probably left by some bored office worker to freak out the cleaning crew. But as I went about my rounds that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The feeling got worse when I got to the 9th floor. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper. My footsteps echoed way louder than they should have. When I passed the elevator again, I caught myself staring at the paper. The words seemed to jump out at me. I forced myself to look away, shaking my head at my own stupidity. "It's just a dumb joke," I mumbled, but my voice sounded way too loud in the empty hallway. As I turned the corner, I could have sworn I heard a faint humming sound behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the hallway. The elevator doors were closed, the paper still there. The humming was gone. Probably just the old pipes, I told myself, or maybe the wind. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The rest of the night was uneventful, but that whole thing stuck with me. By the time I clocked out, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I left the building without looking back, glad to escape the creepy atmosphere. But the next night, I found myself drawn to the elevator again, like I was being pulled by some invisible force. Before I knew it, I was standing in front of the doors, staring at those rules. The paper looked even older, more frayed. I reached out to touch it, half expecting it to crumble, but it didn't. Who writes this stuff? I wondered aloud, my voice echoing in the silence. The elevator's panel flickered, casting an eerie glow on the floor. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like I was trespassing, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. The air felt charged, like the building was holding its breath. I shook my head, forcing myself to walk away. But as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that those rules weren't just some random prank. They felt deliberate, purposeful. And the more I thought about them, the more I wondered, what would happen if someone broke them? The air in the building always felt different after midnight, like the walls were closing in or something. The creaks got louder, as if the old place was coming alive. Usually, it was just a bit unsettling, nothing major. But this night was different. By the time the clock hit 2:30 a.m., I could feel this tension, like something was about to snap, a weight pressing down, you know. I was on the 12th floor, emptying trash bins in the break room, when all hell broke loose. The fire alarm went off, blaring like a banshee, echoing through the empty halls. The sound was deafening, sharp, and urgent, like a siren's wail. I dropped the bag of trash, my heart leaping into my throat. I fumbled for my walkie-talkie, my hands shaking. The building's night supervisor was supposed to be on the other end, but all I got was static. Panic started bubbling up inside me. It was just me tonight. No backup, no one else. Great, I muttered, grabbing the flashlight from my cart. The fire alarm panel was on the ground floor, but I needed to figure out what triggered it first. The sprinklers hadn't gone off, which meant it was probably a false alarm. Still, protocol was protocol. The source of the alarm was listed on the 15th floor. My stomach sank. The thought of trudging up 15 flights of stairs made my knees ache. I glanced at the elevator bank. The out-of-order elevator seemed to mock me, its doors firmly shut, while the newer elevator's panel blinked red. Out of service. Thanks to the alarm system. My eyes lingered on the old elevator. The list of rules flashed in my mind, unbidden and unwelcome. I shook my head. No way. There was no way I was getting on that thing. But as I turned toward the stairwell, a loud, metallic groan stopped me dead in my tracks. The out-of-order elevator's doors slid open. I stared, my flashlight beam wavering as my hands started to tremble. The car inside was lit, dimly but steadily, its panel glowing faintly. It looked clean, almost new, a stark contrast to its battered exterior. My rational mind screamed at me to ignore it, to take the stairs, no matter how long it took. But another part of me, the part that was bone-tired and, frankly, a little freaked out, hesitated. It's just an elevator, but my voice shook. And those rules, they're just a joke. I stepped inside. The air inside was instantly colder, a noticeable drop that made me shiver. The panel was simple numbered buttons for each floor, an emergency stop button. My finger hovered over 15 for a moment, then I pressed it. Nothing happened. Before I could press it again, the button for the 13th floor lit up. I froze, my heart pounding. The list of rules burned in my memory, rule number 2 screaming the loudest. Never press the button for the 13th floor. But I hadn't pressed it. I was sure of it. The elevator lurched, dropping downwards with a groan that sounded more like a living thing than a machine. I jabbed at the emergency stop button, but it did nothing. The walls of the car seemed to press in closer, the air growing thinner. Panic clawed at my throat as the elevator descended, the floor display blinking erratically between numbers. By the time it stopped, the display just showed a flickering 13. The doors slid open with an unnatural smoothness. Beyond them was a hallway I didn't recognize. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on walls covered in peeling, yellowed wallpaper. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, mixed with a metallic tang that made my stomach churn. At the far end of the hallway was a single door, slightly ajar, with a faint light spilling out. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay inside the elevator, to let the doors close and ride it back to safety, if that was even possible. But the humming, that oppressive humming that had started when the elevator first moved, was louder now, almost unbearable. It felt like it was vibrating through my very bones. I stepped out, if only to escape the noise. The floor beneath me creaked, like it hadn't been walked on in decades. I turned back toward the elevator, but the doors slammed shut before I could reach them. My reflection in the shiny metal doors was twisted, unnatural, my face contorted into a grotesque grimace. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. "Stay calm," I whispered to myself, though my voice barely registered over the hum. Just find the stairs and get out. I turned toward the hallway, the door at the end seeming to beckon me forward. With no other options, I started walking, each step echoing louder than the last. As I got closer to the door, I realized the light spilling from it wasn't steady. It flickered, like a dying bulb struggling to stay lit. The metallic tang in the air grew stronger, making my eyes water and my throat burn. When I reached the door, I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling. A sudden, sharp sound behind me made me spin around. The hallway was empty, but the humming had stopped. The silence was deafening. I turned back to the door and pushed it open. What lay beyond defied logic. The room was impossibly large, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The walls were lined with old, rusted filing cabinets, each drawer labeled with names I didn't recognize. In the center of the room stood a single desk, its surface cluttered with papers, a rotary phone, and a small, flickering lamp. The lamp cast long shadows that seemed to move on their own, dancing across the walls in unnatural patterns. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I whirled around, but there was no handle, no way to open it from this side. My heart raced as I turned back to the desk, drawn to the papers scattered across it. Most of them were illegible, the ink smudged or faded, but one stood out. It was another list of rules, written in the same neat but hurried handwriting. 1. You are not alone. 2. Do not answer the phone. 3. Do not open the drawers. 4. If the lamp goes out, hide. The phone began to ring. The ringing of that old rotary phone shattered the silence, each shrill ring slicing through the air like a knife. I froze, the list of rules clutched in my trembling hand. Do not answer the phone. It was right there, as plain as day, just like the first list, burned into my brain. My instinct screamed at me to obey, to just let it ring until it stopped. But the sound, it was unbearable, a grating noise that seemed to vibrate right through my skull. I took a step back from the desk, my eyes darting to the other stuff scattered across it. The lamp's flickering light cast those grotesque, dancing shadows on the walls. Its steady, rhythmic pulses seemed to sync up with the ringing, like they were part of some messed up symphony. Then, just like that, the phone stopped ringing. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The silence that followed was heavy, almost solid, pressing down on me like a physical weight. I turned away from the desk, desperate to find another way out of this nightmare. The filing cabinets lining the walls seemed endless, their rusted drawers sealed shut, like they hadn't been opened in decades. But before I could take another step, the phone started ringing again. Louder this time, more insistent. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it was a force, an intrusive presence that clawed at my mind. I stumbled back toward the desk, my resolve weakening with every ring. My hand hovered over the receiver, shaking. Don't, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the ringing. Don't break the rules. But as the next ring hit, something inside me snapped. The sound was just too much, a relentless assault that left me no choice. My hand shot out, grabbing the receiver. The moment I lifted it, the ringing stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I held the receiver to my ear, my breath coming in shallow gasps. At first, there was nothing but static, a faint crackling that set my teeth on edge. Then, a voice emerged from the void, low and distorted, like it was speaking from the bottom of a deep well. "You shouldn't be here," it said, each word dripping with malice. My grip on the receiver tightened. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What is this place?" The static grew louder, almost drowning out the voice. "Leave now," it hissed, "before it's too late." Before I could respond, the line went dead. The phone emitted a low, continuous tone that sent shivers down my spine. I placed the receiver back on the cradle, my hands shaking as I stepped away from the desk. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. The lamp's flickering had grown erratic. The light was weaker now, each pulse shorter than the last. The memory of the list's final rule surged to the forefront of my mind. If the lamp goes out, hide. A sudden gust of cold air swept through the room, extinguishing the lamp. Darkness swallowed me whole. I dropped to the floor, instinctively crawling toward the nearest filing cabinet. My hands fumbled over the cold, rusted metal, searching for a hiding spot. The oppressive darkness was absolute. My flashlight was useless against it. My breathing was loud in my ears, each inhale and exhale a desperate attempt to stay calm. The hum began again, low and guttural, rising from the very floor beneath me. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a living thing that filled the room with its malevolence. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, as though the very ground struggled to bear their weight. I pressed myself against the filing cabinet, my body trembling. The footsteps grew louder, closer. My mind raced, trying to come up with an escape plan. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The room was too vast, too open, and the thing, whatever it was, would find me. A shadow passed over me, darker than the surrounding void. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't notice me. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, threatening to shatter my composure. The footsteps paused, and for a moment, all was still. Then, a hand, if you could even call it that, descended into my view. It was massive, its fingers long and twisted, with joints that bent in unnatural angles. The skin was mottled and gray, stretched tight over protruding bones. It hovered mere inches from my face, as though it could sense my presence, but couldn't quite pinpoint it. I squeezed my eyes shut, biting down on my lip to keep from screaming. The hand lingered for what felt like an eternity before it withdrew. The footsteps resumed, moving away from me and toward the desk. I risked opening my eyes just enough to see the shadowy form retreating. It loomed over the desk, its monstrous frame bending unnaturally as it examined the objects I had left behind. The phone began to ring again. The creature's head snapped toward it, its body stiffening for a moment. I thought it might answer the call. Instead, it reached out and smashed the phone with a single blow, the sound of shattering plastic echoing through the room. The hum ceased, and the creature turned its attention back to the darkness, as though searching for something or someone. I didn't wait to find out if it would return. Crawling as quietly as I could, I made my way toward the wall, feeling along its surface for any kind of exit. My fingers brushed against something cold and metallic, a doorknob. I twisted it, praying it wasn't locked. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling upward. I slipped through, shutting the door behind me, just as the creature turned back toward where I had been hiding. The last thing I saw was its glowing, lidless eyes staring directly at me. The staircase was narrow and steep, each step groaning under my weight. The walls were lined with the same peeling wallpaper, the smell of mildew even stronger here. My flashlight flickered, its beam barely cutting through the gloom. I climbed as quickly as I could, my legs burning with the effort. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a landing. A single door stood before me, unmarked and unassuming. I hesitated, my hand on the knob. There was no telling what lay beyond it, but I couldn't stay here, not with that thing waiting below. I pushed the door open and stepped through, bracing myself for whatever horrors awaited. But instead of another nightmarish room, I found myself standing in the lobby of the Greystone Tower. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and the air was warm and familiar. It was as if nothing had happened. The elevator doors chimed, drawing my attention. The out-of-order elevator stood open, its interior dark and empty. The list of rules was gone, leaving only a faint outline where the paper had been taped. My cart sat where I had left it, the mop leaning against the side. I stepped back, my mind struggling to reconcile what I had just experienced. The building was silent, but the memory of the hum lingered, vibrating faintly in my chest. I turned toward the front doors, eager to leave, but something made me stop. On the reception desk lay a single piece of paper. I approached it cautiously, my heart sinking as I recognized the neat, hurried handwriting. The list of rules had returned, but this time a single line had been added at the bottom: 7. You are part of it now. The world outside the Greystone Tower felt wrong. The city lights were too bright, the streets too empty for what should have been the middle of the night. I stepped onto the pavement, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. The air was cold, biting against my skin, but more than the chill, it was the eerie quiet that unsettled me. No honking cars, no distant hum of activity, only silence oppressive and unnatural. As I walked away from the building, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, always gone when I turned to look. My heart raced with every step, my body tense, as if waiting for something or someone to emerge from the darkness. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch, my hands still trembling. The events of the night played over and over in my mind, each detail more surreal than the last. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but the screen remained black, unresponsive. Even the clock on the wall had stopped, its hands frozen at 3:00 a.m. That's when I noticed it, a faint, pulsating hum. It wasn't coming from the building or the street outside, it was coming from me. I stumbled to the bathroom, pulling off my jacket and shirt. My reflection in the mirror was pale, sweat glistening on my forehead. At first glance, I seemed fine, just shaken. But as I leaned closer, I saw it. A mark on my chest, faint but unmistakable. It was a circular symbol, etched into my skin as if branded. The lines were intricate, twisting and looping in ways that made my head hurt to follow. Panic surged through me. I scrubbed at the mark with soap and water, but it didn't fade. It wasn't a stain or dirt. It was part of me now, as permanent as the rules I had broken. I stumbled back into the living room, my breath coming in short. Ragged gasps. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest in time with the mark's faint glow. I grabbed a blanket and curled up on the couch, willing myself to believe it was all a bad dream. But sleep didn't come. The hum wouldn't let me rest. The next few days passed in a haze. I couldn't bring myself to go back to the Greystone Tower. Just the thought of stepping inside that building made my stomach churn. But no matter how far I stayed away, the mark's presence remained, a constant reminder of what had happened. It pulsed faintly in the dark, the hum growing louder whenever I tried to ignore it. And then the dreams began. Every night I found myself back in the elevator, the buttons glowing faintly, the walls pressing closer with each descent. The list of rules floated before me, the letters shifting and rearranging until they formed new warnings, ones I couldn't remember when I woke up. But one thing was always clear: I was being drawn back. Something or someone was calling me. It was a week after that first night when the phone rang. Not my cell phone, which still refused to turn on, but the rotary phone in my apartment. I didn't even remember owning one, but there it was, sitting on the side table, its black receiver vibrating with each chime. My heart sank as I approached it. Memories of the phone in the Greystone Tower flooded back, and with them, the warnings: do not answer the phone. But this wasn't the tower, this was my home. Surely the rules didn't apply here, right? The ringing continued, each chime more insistent than the last. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. Finally, unable to bear the sound any longer, I picked it up. Hello. The voice on the other end was faint, distorted by static. You need to come back, it said. It's not over. Who is this? I demanded, my voice trembling. The static grew louder, drowning out the voice, but before the line went dead, I heard one last word, clear and unmistakable. Run, Ba. I dropped the receiver, my blood turning to ice. The hum in my chest grew louder, more insistent. The mark on my skin burned, the lines shifting and twisting as though alive. I clutched at it, trying to make it stop, but the pain only intensified. Then the lights in my apartment flickered and went out. The darkness was immediate and absolute, swallowing everything. My flashlight sat on the coffee table, its faint glow barely piercing the gloom. I reached for it, but before I could grab it, the hum erupted into a deafening roar. The walls of my apartment shook, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. And then I saw them. Shadows, darker than the surrounding blackness, moving toward me. Their forms were indistinct, shifting and writhing like smoke, but their intent was clear. They were coming for me. I grabbed the flashlight and ran, barreling through the door and into the hallway. The emergency lights had come on, casting the corridor in a dim, reddish glow. My footsteps echoed as I sprinted toward the exit, the shadows close behind. Their hum was everywhere, reverberating through the building, growing louder with each passing second. When I reached the stairwell, I didn't hesitate. I threw myself down the steps, taking them two at a time, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. By the time I reached the lobby, the shadows were right behind me. The front doors were just ahead, their glass panes reflecting the distorted forms chasing me. I slammed into them, pushing with all my strength, but they didn't budge. The hum reached a crescendo, the air vibrating with its intensity. I turned to face the shadows, my back pressed against the doors. They loomed before me, their forms coalescing into something almost human, almost. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The largest of the shadows stepped forward, its glowing eyes locking onto mine. When it spoke, its voice was a low, guttural rumble that resonated through my very soul. "You broke the rules." The shadow's words echoed in the cold, empty lobby. "You broke the rules." My heart pounded as the looming figures pressed close, their forms twisting and billowing like smoke in a windless room. Their eyes, glowing faintly like embers, were fixed on me. There was no escape. I was cornered, out of options. I could feel the mark on my chest burning with an intensity that threatened to consume me. "I didn't mean to," I stammered, backing further into the glass doors. "It was an emergency. I didn't have a choice." The largest shadow paused, tilting its head as if considering my words. The others seemed to halt in unison, their movements eerily synchronized. For a moment, the lobby was deathly quiet, save for the persistent hum reverberating in my chest. "Intent does not absolve," the shadow finally replied, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "The rules exist for a reason." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "Then tell me," I pleaded. "Why are they there? What is this mark? What do you want from me?" The shadows exchanged glances, or at least, that's what it seemed like. Their faceless forms shifted slightly, and the largest one stepped closer. I braced myself, expecting it to strike, but instead, it extended a limb, a swirling tendril of darkness, and pointed toward the elevator at the far end of the lobby. "The answers you seek lie within," it said, "but the price must be paid." I didn't want to go back. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to fight, to do anything but step into that cursed elevator again. But the shadows left me no choice. As I hesitated, the largest one moved closer, its form towering over me. "Go," it commanded, the word reverberating through the air. "Face what you have unleashed, or let the mark consume you." The burning in my chest flared, the pain doubling me over. I cried out, clutching at the mark, its glow now lighting up the dim lobby. The shadows remained still, watching, waiting. I knew they wouldn't let me leave until I did as they asked. With shaking legs, I forced myself upright and stumbled toward the elevator. The doors slid open as I approached, revealing the familiar, dimly lit interior. The buttons gleamed faintly, their surfaces unmarred except for the conspicuous absence of a button labeled 13. My reflection stared back at me in the polished walls, pale and terrified. "You must descend," the shadow said, its voice now softer but no less menacing. "And you must survive." The doors closed behind me with a finality that sent a chill down my spine. The hum in my chest synchronized with the elevator's faint vibrations as it began its descent. This time there was no control panel to press, no way to stop or change course. The elevator moved on its own, the floors ticking by faster than they should. The air grew colder with each passing moment, my breath fogging up in front of me. The faint hum became a low, rhythmic thrum, echoing off the walls. I glanced around, my pulse quickening. The walls seemed closer than before, the space shrinking with each passing second. Then the elevator jolted to a stop. The sudden silence was deafening. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing happened. The doors didn't open. The elevator didn't move. I was trapped in the oppressive stillness. Is this the price? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The mark on my chest flared again, the pain sharper this time. I fell to my knees, gasping. As the glow intensified, I saw faint shapes forming on the walls, shadowy figures like the ones in the lobby, their faces, or what passed for faces, pressed against the metal, watching me. Whispered voices filled the elevator, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. Pay the price, they murmured. Pay the price and be free. The doors finally slid open with a soft chime, revealing a corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were lined with old, flickering lights, their dim glow casting long, shifting shadows. The air was heavy, each breath was a struggle. I stepped out cautiously, the elevator doors closing behind me with a hollow thud. The moment they shut, the hum in my chest subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant beat that seemed to come from the corridor itself. It pulsed in time with my heartbeat, guiding me forward. As I walked, the whispers grew louder. They seemed to emanate from the walls, the floor, the very air around me. They spoke of the rules of those who had broken them before, their fates not kind. What price? I shouted into the void. What do you want from me? The whispers fell silent for a moment. There was nothing but the faint buzz of the lights and the steady beat of my pulse. Then, a voice, deep, commanding, and unmistakable, spoke from the darkness ahead. The price is choice. A door materialized at the end of the corridor, its surface marked with the same symbol that now burned on my chest. The moment I touched the handle, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They warned me, begged me, cursed me, but I couldn't turn back. The door swung open, revealing a room bathed in an otherworldly light. At its center stood a pedestal, and on it 2 objects, a key and a coin. Above them, words carved into the stone wall read, "Choose and be bound. Choose and be free." I stepped forward, my hands trembling. The shadows closed in around me, their forms shifting and swirling, their voices now a deafening roar. The mark on my chest pulsed painfully, urging me to decide. The key gleamed, its surface pristine and inviting. The coin, dull and weathered, seemed almost forgotten in comparison. Both radiated a power that made my skin crawl. What happens if I choose wrong? I whispered, my voice barely audible over the cacophony. The shadows didn't answer. The choice was mine alone. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the key, then the coin. The weight of the decision pressed down on me, the implications unknowable. My heart raced as I closed my eyes, letting instinct guide me. And then I made my choice. The air felt heavier as my fingers hovered over the objects on the pedestal. The key's polished surface caught the eerie light, gleaming with an almost hypnotic allure. The coin, dull and worn, radiated a quiet power that was just as compelling. The shadows around me pulsed and shifted, their whispered voices now a frenzied cacophony of unintelligible words. I couldn't stall any longer. My hand trembled as I reached out, closing around the coin. The moment my fingers touched its surface, the whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. The mark on my chest flared with white, hot pain, and I dropped to my knees, clutching at my chest as the world around me dissolved into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the strange, glowing room. I was standing in the lobby of the building, but everything was different. The walls, once clean and sterile, were now cracked and overgrown with vines that pulsed faintly with the same light as my mark. The shadows were gone, but their presence lingered, like an unshakable weight. I looked down at the coin in my hand. It was warm, almost alive, and inscribed with strange symbols that seemed to shift when I stared at them. The mark on my chest had stopped burning, but its faint glow persisted, pulsing in rhythm with the coin. "You chose," a voice said behind me. I turned to see the largest shadow, now less of a figure and more of a shape etched into the air itself. "The binding is complete." "What does that mean?" I demanded. "What did I just do?" The shadow didn't answer directly. Instead, it gestured toward the elevator, which stood open and waiting. "The path forward is yours to tread. The choice you made binds you to the building. You are now its keeper, Dom." "Keeper," I repeated, my voice rising. "What does that even mean? I didn't ask for this." "None of us did," the shadow replied, its voice softening. "But the rules must be upheld, the balance maintained." The shadow faded, leaving me alone in the ruined lobby. I turned back to the elevator, its open doors beckoning me. I stepped inside cautiously, gripping the coin tightly. The interior was no longer pristine. The walls were scratched and dented, and the buttons glowed faintly, as if powered by some unseen force. This time, there was a new button 13. I hesitated, then pressed it. The elevator began its ascent, moving smoothly at first, but then shuddering violently as it passed each floor. The hum returned, louder than ever, and the air grew colder. When the doors finally opened, I stepped out into a space that defied logic. The 13th floor was an endless expanse of corridors, each one lined with doors. Some were open, revealing glimpses of impossible landscapes, a sunlit meadow, a raging ocean, a void of stars. Others were locked, their handles marked with the same shifting symbols as the coin. "The keeper," a voice whispered. I turned to see a figure emerging from one of the open doors. It was another shadow, but smaller and more human in shape. Its eyes glowed faintly, and it regarded me with an almost sympathetic expression. "What is this place?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "This is the building's heart," it replied. "Every choice made within its walls leads here. Every rule broken, every path taken adds to its corridors. And now you are its keeper." "Why me?" I demanded. "I didn't ask for this. I just wanted to do my job and go home." The shadow tilted its head, its expression unreadable. "The building chooses. It always has. Days, or perhaps weeks, passed as I explored the 13th floor. Time had little meaning in the building's heart. I discovered rooms filled with memories that weren't mine, corridors that looped back on themselves, and doors that led to places I could barely comprehend. The coin remained warm in my hand, its glow a constant reminder of the choice I had made. Gradually, I began to understand my role. The building was alive, a sentient entity bound by its own rules. It needed a keeper to maintain its balance, to ensure the rules were followed and the corridors didn't spiral into chaos. The mark on my chest linked me to the building, allowing me to navigate its labyrinthine floors and interact with its impossible spaces. But it was a lonely existence. The shadows offered little companionship, and the glimpses of other lives through the open doors only reminded me of what I had lost. I wondered if I would ever escape, or if I was doomed to wander the building's endless halls forever. One day, as I stood before a door marked with a symbol I didn't recognize, the coin in my hand grew cold. The mark on my chest flared briefly, and the door swung open. Beyond it was a room bathed in golden light. Its walls were lined with shelves of books and artifacts. At the center of the room was a pedestal, identical to the one I had seen before. On it rested a single object, a key. "The way out," a voice said behind me. I turned to see the shadowy figure watching me. "You have served the building well. It offers you a choice. Remain as its keeper, or leave and return to the life you left behind." I stared at the key, my heart pounding. After everything I had endured, the thought of leaving was almost too much to bear. But the idea of staying, of spending the rest of my existence bound to the building, was equally daunting. "What happens if I leave?" I asked. "The building will find another," the shadow replied. "It always does." I hesitated, my hand hovering over the key. The weight of my choice pressed down on me, heavier than anything I had felt before. And then, with a deep breath, I made my decision. The gig seemed simple enough, at least on paper: chart the cave system, gather some geological data, and report back. But something about the whole setup felt off, like a bad smell you can't quite place. The briefing was sketchy, way too vague for my liking. When I tried to press for details, the guy in charge, some suit named Mr. Davies, just gave me these canned answers that didn't explain jack. "Let's just get this show on the road," I said, cutting through the BS. "My name's Alex, by the way." Next to me, Sarah, the geologist, nodded, adjusting the straps on her backpack. Sarah was the practical type, always prepared. She was the best in the business. Mr. Davies had insisted on her. Said she was the only one he trusted with something this important, whatever that meant. Then there was Ben, our tech whiz, fiddling with his GPS tracker. He gave me a small, tight smile, the kind that said he trusted me to keep things from going sideways, which, considering our current circumstances, was a pretty big ask. The first few steps into the cave were a total non-event, except for this weird silence. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of our boots on loose gravel. The air was cold and stale, with this faint metallic tang that clung to the back of your throat. Creepy. Inside, our headlamps made these narrow little beams, lighting up the jagged walls and the messed up floor. Sarah stopped every few feet, running her fingers over the rock and scribbling notes in her waterproof notebook. Ben marked our progress on the handheld GPS, his face unreadable as usual. I focused on setting up reflective markers to guide us back to the surface, trying not to think about how far underground we were. It wasn't long before we hit our first red flag. About 50 meters in, I spotted something weird on the ground. I crouched down, shining my headlamp on these faint impressions in the dirt. Footprints. They were faint but definitely there, and fresh, recent enough that the edges hadn't crumbled yet. "Hey, Sarah, Ben, check this out," I called. "Doesn't look like ours." I traced the outline of a boot with my gloved finger. "Too fresh." Sarah frowned, her usual skepticism melting away into something like worry. "Could be hikers who got curious after the landslide," she offered, "though I can't imagine anyone coming out this far without proper equipment. Whoever it was, they went deeper," Ben added, pointing at the trail that disappeared into the darkness. We exchanged glances, and I could tell we were all thinking the same thing. We weren't alone in here, but there was no turning back, not yet. We pushed on, following the trail. The footprints got fainter and fainter until they vanished completely near a collapsed part of the cave. The rocks here were massive, way too heavy to have been moved by hand. It was like someone or something had deliberately sealed off whatever lay beyond. "Looks like it's been this way for a while," Sarah said, studying the rubble. "Could have been an old mining operation, maybe even a natural collapse." I wasn't buying it. The pile of debris seemed too neat, too precise. But I kept my mouth shut. We set up our base camp near the entrance, where a sliver of natural light still reached. By the time we finished unpacking and organizing our gear, the sun had dipped below the horizon, plunging the area into darkness. The only sound was the faint whistle of the wind and the occasional creak of shifting rock. After dinner, I decided to do a final check of the equipment. The radio antenna, mounted on a tripod outside, was supposed to keep us in contact with our extraction team. When I stepped out into the cold, something felt off. The antenna was leaning at a weird angle. I walked over cautiously, scanning the ground for tracks. There were none, just the faint indentation where the tripod legs had shifted. It could have been the wind, I told myself, even though the air was still. I straightened it, tightened the bolts, and headed back inside. "Everything okay?" Ben asked when I returned. "Yeah," I lied, avoiding his gaze. I didn't want to spook them, not yet. That night sleep was a joke. The wind outside seemed louder, almost on purpose, and every creak of the cave sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was just nerves, the natural unease of being in a place that didn't want us there. But when I woke up the next morning and found the antenna bent again, I knew we had a problem. "Someone's messing with us," I said, my voice tight. "This isn't the wind." Sarah looked pale, her usual confidence shaken. "What are you saying?" "That someone's out here deliberately sabotaging us." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe they're just trying to scare us." Ben didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He was thinking the same thing I was. If someone wanted us gone, they might not stop at scare tactics. We packed up our gear and headed back into the cave, this time sticking closer together. The atmosphere felt heavier, the silence more intense. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of our boots, the drip of water from unseen crevices, the faint rustle of loose rocks. It was like the cave itself was listening to us. About 100 meters in, Sarah stopped suddenly. "Over here," she said, her voice low. She pointed to a section of the wall where the rock was smoother, almost polished. Faint marks crisscrossed the surface, like someone had used it as a makeshift storage area. Nearby, we found an empty crate tucked behind a ledge. Its surface was damp, the wood warped from years of exposure, but the lack of dust suggested it had been moved recently. Smugglers, maybe, Ben offered, or illegal miners, could explain the footprints. Then why seal off part of the cave? I asked, and why mess with our gear? Nobody had an answer. We continued mapping the cave, but the feeling of being watched just kept growing. Our headlamps flickered on and off, even though we had fresh batteries. Ben swore he saw movement in the shadows, though nothing was there when we checked. Sarah's notes became more erratic, her usually neat handwriting replaced by scribbled observations. By the time we returned to camp that evening, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. None of us spoke as we made dinner, each lost in our own thoughts. I kept glancing at the entrance, half expecting to see a shadow lurking just out of sight. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound of faint scraping, like metal on stone. I sat up, my heart hammering in my chest, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and slipped out of my sleeping bag, careful not to wake the others. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the cave walls. Nothing moved, but the sound continued, faint and deliberate. It was coming from deeper inside the cave. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to wake Sarah and Ben, to face whatever this was together. But another part, a primal fear I couldn't shake, urged me to go alone. I followed the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, the metallic tang stronger. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, the darkness felt alive, pressing against me from all sides. When I reached the source of the noise, I froze. The footprints were back, smaller than mine, distinct in the dust, and they led deeper into the cave. My heart was pounding in my chest like a drum as I crouched to examine them closer. The edges were crisp, fresh. Someone had been here, maybe within hours. I scanned the corridor with my flashlight, but it only caught jagged walls and the glint of moisture on the rocks. No movement. The footprints simply stopped about 10 feet ahead of where I was standing, disappearing into what looked like an unmarked section of the cave. I didn't call out. Whoever had been here either didn't want to be seen or wanted to scare us. And if it was the latter, they were doing a damn good job. My fingers tightened around the handle of the flashlight as I took a step back. The air felt colder now, heavier, almost thick with something I couldn't place. When I turned and made my way back to camp, the sound of my own footsteps seemed unnaturally loud. Sarah and Ben were still asleep when I returned, the faint glow of the heater casting soft shadows across the makeshift camp. I stood at the entrance, listening for anything out of place, a shuffle, a whisper, even the faint scrape I had heard earlier. But there was only silence, deep and oppressive. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, the feeling of unease hadn't lifted. Over breakfast, I hesitated, debating whether to tell Sarah and Ben about the footprints. In the end, I decided to keep it to myself. They were already on edge, and until I had more than a few marks in the dirt, I didn't want to add to the tension. We packed up our equipment and got ready to head deeper into the cave. Sarah double-checked the first aid supplies, while Ben methodically inspected his rock sampling tools. His hands were steady, but there was a nervous energy to him this morning, as though he could sense the same undercurrent I felt. The first stretch of the day was uneventful. We marked our path with reflective tape and documented the cavern layout. The jagged walls gave way to smoother, almost polished stone, likely shaped by years of underground water flow. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly in the distance. Sarah stopped abruptly about 50 meters in. "Look at this," she said, her voice low. We gathered around a section of the wall where faint marks crisscrossed the rock. They were subtle, like scratches, but deliberate enough to suggest human activity. "Could have been miners," Sarah offered, "though it doesn't explain why there's no record of this place being worked on." Ben traced a hand over the marks, his brow furrowed. "It's odd," he said. "These scratches don't look random. They're more like storage markings. Inventory, maybe." We exchanged uneasy glances but pressed on. A few minutes later, Sarah called us over. She'd spotted a waterproof crate tucked into a narrow crevice behind a rock ledge. Its surface was damp, warped by years of exposure, but it lacked the dust and debris that coated everything else in the cave. "It's been moved recently," she said, pointing to the clear outline in the dirt where the crate had been placed. The lid was open, and inside there was nothing. Just empty space. Whatever was in here, someone came back for it, I said, my voice sounding flat even to me. "Smugglers?" Ben asked, his skepticism wavering. "Maybe," Sarah said, but her tone suggested she didn't believe it either. By the time we reached the main gallery, the air had turned seriously cold. The temperature drop wasn't gradual, it was sudden, sharp, like stepping into a walk-in freezer. Our breath misted in the light of our headlamps, and Ben muttered something about thermal anomalies. We set up our mapping equipment, but the atmosphere felt heavy, oppressive. Sarah, who usually worked in silence, kept glancing over her shoulder. Ben's movements were more hurried, less precise than usual. Halfway through marking the gallery, my headlamp flickered. I tapped it, figuring it was a loose connection, but the light went out completely. "Great," I muttered, pulling out a spare battery pack. When I glanced up, I saw Sarah fiddling with her own headlamp. "Yours too?" she asked. I nodded, replacing the batteries. Ben's light flickered briefly before stabilizing. "It's strange," Sarah said. "These batteries were fresh this morning." I shrugged, trying to play it cool. "Could be the cold," I said. "It drains power faster." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Something about the timing felt deliberate, like another warning. We called it quits earlier than planned, all of us too rattled to continue. As I unpacked my gear, I noticed something strange. The nylon rope I'd packed, a crucial tool for navigating uneven terrain, was missing. "Ben, did you take my rope?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. He looked up, startled. "No, why would I?" "Maybe you misplaced it," Sarah offered, though there was doubt in her voice. I knew I hadn't. The rope had been packed neatly with the rest of my gear that morning. Someone had taken it, or moved it, and the implications were impossible to ignore. Later, when I went to refill my canteen, I found it sitting on the edge of the camp, where I definitely hadn't left it. The cap was loose, and the faint smell of damp earth clung to the surface. Sarah noticed my expression and walked over. "What's wrong?" I hesitated, then showed her the canteen. "It's not where I left it." She frowned, taking it from me. "Are you sure?" "Maybe." "I'm sure," I interrupted, my tone sharper than I intended. Sarah nodded slowly. She didn't argue, but the look in her eyes told me she was starting to feel it too. The sense that we were being watched, that something was seriously off. That night, sleep was a lost cause. Every creak of the cave, every faint drip of water, felt amplified. My mind kept circling back to the footprints, the crate, the missing rope. Someone was trying to unsettle us, and it was working. Around midnight, I heard it again, the faint scraping sound, like metal on stone. It started softly, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I sat up, my flashlight already in hand. Sarah stirred beside me, her brow furrowed in sleep. I debated waking her, but something held me back. The sound came from the direction of the main gallery. I crept toward the entrance of the camp, my flashlight casting narrow beams across the jagged walls. The air felt colder again, biting against my exposed skin. When I reached the gallery, the sound stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath loud in my ears. Then, from the darkness, a faint click echoed, a deliberate, human sound. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic, just as it disappeared around a corner. I didn't follow. I couldn't. Instead, I backed away slowly, every muscle in my body tense. By the time I returned to camp, the sound had faded entirely. Sarah was awake now, her expression sharp with concern. "What happened?" she asked. I hesitated. "Someone's here," I said finally, "and they're not trying to stay hidden anymore." Sarah's face hardened. Ben sat up, groggy and confused, but Sarah and I exchanged a look that said it all. We weren't alone, and whoever was out there didn't want us here. Morning came reluctantly, the weak light barely penetrating the cavern entrance. None of us had slept much. Sarah sat by the camp heater, staring into her mug of instant coffee like it might give her answers. Ben meticulously packed his tools, avoiding eye contact with either of us. The tension was so thick you could choke on it. "We need to move forward," I said, breaking the silence. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "If someone's here, we can't stay in one place too long." "Forward to where?" Ben asked, his tone sharper than usual. "We've already mapped the main gallery. If someone's messing with us, we should head back to the surface and call for extraction on a radio that might not even work. We're too deep." Sarah cut in, her voice calm but pointed. "And you know it. We'd waste hours climbing out just to find out we're still cut off." I could see the conflict in Ben's eyes. He didn't want to admit she was right. None of us did. Returning to the surface wasn't an option, not until we had more information or a real emergency. "Let's push deeper," I said, gesturing to the equipment. "If we find more signs of sabotage, we pull out." Agreed. Ben hesitated but nodded. Sarah didn't argue. We moved cautiously, retracing our steps to the main gallery. The polished walls seemed even smoother in the dim light of our headlamps, as if they had been deliberately shaped. The air was colder here, carrying that damp, metallic tang that made my throat tighten. Sarah paused to take samples of the sediment along the floor. She murmured something about unusual mineral deposits, but didn't elaborate. Ben was more focused on examining the scratches on the walls again, his hands hovering over them as if touching them might tell him more than his eyes could. "They're too consistent," he said finally, "not random. Someone definitely left these intentionally." I stepped closer, shining my light on the markings. They were shallow, almost like tally marks in some places, but in others, they seemed more like symbols, a language or code I couldn't understand. "What do you think they mean?" Sarah asked. Ben shook his head. "Should be inventory, like I said, or—" He trailed off, his expression hard to read. "Or what?" I pressed. "Or warnings," he said quietly. We pressed on, following the faint draft of air that hinted at an unexplored passage. It led us to a section of the cave we hadn't mapped yet, a narrow corridor that forced us to move single file. The walls here were rougher, jagged, and the floor was slick with moisture. Our progress was slow, every step deliberate. About 20 minutes in, we reached a dead end. Or so it seemed. The narrow corridor widened abruptly into a small chamber, and at the far end, a barricade of old timbers and rusted metal plates blocked the way. The beams were dark with age, their surfaces warped and splintered, but they were intact. "This doesn't look natural," Sarah said, running her hand along one of the beams. "It's not," Ben confirmed. "This is reinforced construction. Someone sealed this deliberately." "Why?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. No one replied. Instead, we stood there in silence, staring at the makeshift barrier like it might tell us its secrets if we waited long enough. Finally, I sighed and pulled my multi-tool from my belt. "Let's find out." It took all three of us to remove the barricade. The beams were heavier than they looked, and the metal plates had rusted into the rock, making them difficult to pry loose. Every creak of the timbers echoed through the chamber, amplifying the tension in the air. When the last beam fell away, we were met with darkness. The passage beyond was narrower than the corridor we'd just come through, and the air that rushed out was cold and stale, carrying a faint smell of something I couldn't place. I shone my flashlight into the opening, revealing a short tunnel that widened into another chamber. The walls here were different, smoother, almost polished, like the ones in the main gallery. "What is this place?" Sarah murmured. Ben didn't answer. He was already stepping through the opening, his flashlight sweeping the walls. Sarah and I followed, our footsteps muffled by the damp floor. The chamber was larger than it had seemed from the entrance, with a high ceiling that disappeared into shadows. Old survey markers were scattered across the floor, wooden stakes and rusted nails that looked decades old. In the center of the room was a metal table, its surface coated in a thick layer of dust. Scattered across it were scraps of paper, some yellowed with age, others torn and faded. I picked one up, careful not to tear it further. The handwriting was cramped and uneven, the ink smudged in places. "The air is wrong. Something in it isn't natural. We have to leave." but the way back is sealed. Someone doesn't want us out. I handed the paper to Sarah, who read it silently before passing it to Ben. He scanned it quickly, then set it back on the table with a muttered curse. Whatever they were doing here, he said, it didn't end well. As we searched the chamber, Ben found something else, a fragment of an old map, drawn hastily on a piece of torn paper. It showed a section of the cave we hadn't explored yet, marked with crude symbols and a single word, exit. This doesn't make sense, Ben said, turning the map over in his hands. Why would they mark an exit and then seal themselves in? Maybe they didn't seal it, Sarah suggested. Maybe someone else did. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. We decided to follow the map. The promise of an exit was too tempting to ignore, especially with the way things were going. But as we prepared to leave the chamber, we heard its footsteps. They were faint at first, distant, but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving through the corridor we'd just come from. I motioned for Sarah and Ben to turn off their lights. We stood there in the darkness, the sound of our breathing barely audible over the soft, deliberate steps echoing closer. Two shadows appeared in the mouth of the chamber, their shapes barely distinguishable in the faint light. They stopped just outside the entrance, whispering to each other in low voices we couldn't make out. My heart raced as I tightened my grip on the flashlight, ready to use it as a weapon if I had to. Sarah's hand brushed against mine, a silent reassurance, or maybe a plea for calm. The shadows lingered for what felt like an eternity before retreating back into the corridor. Their footsteps faded into silence, leaving us alone once more. We need to go, I whispered. Ben nodded, his face pale but determined. Sarah didn't argue. With the map as our guide, we stepped into the unknown, the faint draft of air our only promise of escape. The faint draft carried us deeper. The map Ben held was our guide, its crude lines promising an exit that none of us entirely trusted. The weight of silence pressed heavily on us, broken only by the muffled crunch of our boots on the damp stone floor. Every step felt like a gamble, each decision pushing us further from the relative safety of what we knew and closer to whatever was waiting for us. The corridor narrowed until we were forced to move single file again. Sarah was at the rear, her movements methodical, and Ben led the way, clutching the map with a kind of desperate determination. I kept my flashlight trained ahead, its beam carving out faint shadows on the walls. My grip was tight, my fingers numb despite the warmth of my gloves. None of us spoke. There was no need. The growing tension between us was as tangible as the cold air that seeped through the cracks in the rock. About 30 minutes into our trek, the floor beneath us changed. It sloped downward, the angle steep enough that Ben nearly lost his footing. He steadied himself against the wall, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Careful," he said, his voice low. "It's slick here." Sarah and I nodded, though the warning felt unnecessary. The darkness was suffocating, and every step demanded our full attention. The polished stone reflected the light in strange, fragmented ways, making it hard to tell where the floor ended and the walls began. A sudden noise froze us in place. It wasn't the faint scraping we'd heard before, nor the whispered voices of our unwelcome company. This was a sharp clang, metallic and deliberate, as if something had struck a solid surface. The sound echoed down the corridor, bouncing off the walls until it was impossible to tell its origin. Ben turned to me, his eyes wide.
That wasn't us.
No, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't. Sarah stepped closer, her flashlight sweeping the area behind us. If they're trying to scare us, it's working. Stay calm, I said, though my own heart was pounding. Let's keep moving. We can't afford to stop now. Ben hesitated, his gaze darting toward the way we had come. I knew what he was thinking. We all did. If someone was trying to corner us, the worst thing we could do was linger in one place. I motioned for him to keep going. Reluctantly, he turned and resumed the slow, cautious descent. The air grew colder the deeper we went, and the walls seemed to close in around us. The passage eventually leveled out, leading us to a wide chasm that yawned open like a wound in the earth. A narrow bridge of stone spanned the gap, its surface slick with moisture. The drop below was impossible to gauge. Our flashlights couldn't penetrate the darkness. "This doesn't look safe," Sarah said, peering over the edge. "It's our only way forward," I said, though I didn't like it any more than she did. "One at a time. Test each step before you commit." Ben went first, his movements slow and deliberate. The stone groaned under his weight but held firm. He reached the other side and waved for me to follow. I moved cautiously, my flashlight illuminating the precarious path ahead. The damp surface made each step feel treacherous, but I focused on keeping my balance. By the time I reached the other side, my legs were trembling. Sarah followed last, her expression grim. She was halfway across when it happened. A sudden crack echoed through the chamber, and a section of the bridge crumbled beneath her. She stumbled, her arms flailing, as she struggled to regain her footing. Ben and I lunged forward, each of us grabbing one of her arms and pulling her to safety, just as another piece of the bridge gave way, tumbling into the abyss. We sat there for a moment, catching our breath. Sarah's hands were shaking, but she forced a weak smile. "Guess that wasn't as solid as it looked." Ben didn't respond. He was staring at the remaining section of the bridge, his expression unreadable. "We can't go back now," I said, "even if we wanted to." Sarah nodded, though the tension in her face didn't ease. "Let's keep moving." The map led us through another series of narrow corridors, their walls lined with strange indentations that looked almost like shelves. Ben paused to examine one of them, his flashlight revealing faint scratches that mirrored the markings we'd seen earlier. "This place wasn't just a mine," he said. "It was used to store supplies, maybe, or something else." Sarah glanced at him. "Something else." He didn't answer, but the unease in his expression spoke volumes. We reached another chamber, this one larger than any we'd seen before. The ceiling arched high above us, supported by jagged columns of stone that jutted from the floor like broken teeth. In the center of the room was a metal crate, its surface corroded and pitted with rust. Sarah approached it cautiously, her flashlight revealing a set of heavy chains that secured the lid. The padlock was intact, though its surface was worn with age. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to keep this sealed," she said. "Or to keep something inside," Ben added, his voice low. I circled the crate, my mind racing. The markings we'd seen, the map fragment, the whispers in the dark, it all felt connected, though I couldn't piece together how. Whatever was in that crate, it was important enough for someone to protect it, even in a place like this. "Let's not open it," I said finally. "Not yet." Sarah nodded, but Ben looked conflicted. He hesitated for a moment before stepping away, his gaze lingering on the crate, as if it might reveal its secrets if he stared long enough. We barely had time to process our discovery before the sound of footsteps reached us again. They were closer this time, deliberate and unhurried. Whoever was following us wasn't bothering to hide anymore. I motioned for Ben and Sarah to douse their lights, and we crouched behind one of the stone columns, our breaths shallow. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint murmur of voices. 2 figures entered the chamber, their flashlights casting sharp beams across the walls. They moved with purpose, their silhouettes sharp against the dim light. I tightened my grip on the multi-tool in my pocket, my mind racing. If they found us, we'd have no choice but to confront them. And if they were armed. The intruders stopped near the crate, their voices low but tense. One of them gestured toward the chains, and the other produced a set of bolt cutters. My stomach twisted as I realized what they were about to do. Sarah's hand brushed against my arm, her grip firm. She didn't need to say anything. I knew what she was thinking. If they opened that crate, whatever was inside might be worse than anything we'd encountered so far. We had to act. I motioned for Ben to stay put and gestured for Sarah to follow me. Together, we crept along the edge of the chamber, using the shadows to mask our movements. The intruders were focused on the crate, their backs turned to us. When we were close enough, I took a deep breath and stepped into the light. I shouted, my voice echoing through the chamber. The intruders spun around, their flashlights blinding me for a moment. One of them reached for something at his side, a weapon. Maybe, but Sarah was faster. She hurled a rock at his hand, knocking whatever he was holding to the ground. "Leave it," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever's in that crate, it's not worth it." For a moment, the intruders didn't move. Then, without a word, they turned and disappeared back into the corridor, their footsteps fading into the distance. I exhaled slowly, my heart still pounding. Sarah stepped up beside me, her expression grim. "That won't be the last we see of them," she said. "I know," I said, "but at least we bought ourselves some time." We didn't linger in the chamber. Whatever was in that crate, it wasn't our problem anymore. We had a map to follow, and the faint promise of an exit was the only thing keeping us moving. As we left the chamber behind, the sound of footsteps returned, fainter this time but still present. The shadows around us seemed darker, the air colder. Whoever was following us wasn't done yet, and neither were we. The shadows around us seemed to thicken as we pushed forward. The air was growing colder, almost bitter, and every sound carried an unnatural weight. Ben led with the map, his steps quick but calculated. Sarah was behind him, her breathing steady but tense. I kept to the rear, flashlight held high, sweeping the darkness for any sign of movement. Whoever or whatever was following us hadn't stopped. The faint echo of footsteps behind us served as a constant reminder that time was running out. The map promised an exit, but with every step forward, it felt more like a gamble than a guarantee. We came to another narrow passage, barely wide enough to squeeze through single file. The walls were rough here, jagged, and the floor was uneven, forcing us to move cautiously. Ben slowed, studying the map under the faint glow of his flashlight. According to this, he whispered, "We're close. There should be a large chamber ahead. From there, the exit route should be clear." Sarah looked over his shoulder, her voice low. "If this map's right, and if the exit isn't sealed, like the others." Ben didn't answer, but I could see the doubt in his expression. Still, we pressed on. The passage eventually opened into a cavern larger than anything we'd seen before. The ceiling arched high above us, lost in shadows, and the walls were covered in strange, angular markings, symbols, carved deep into the stone. They were unlike the scratches we'd seen earlier, more deliberate, almost mathematical in their precision. "What is this?" Sarah murmured, running her fingers along one of the carvings. "It's different, older." Ben was silent, his eyes scanning the room. "This doesn't feel right," he said finally. "We need to move quickly." He was right. The room felt wrong, like the air itself was pressing down on us. The faint metallic tang we'd noticed earlier was stronger here, almost suffocating. I stepped closer to one of the walls, shining my flashlight over the carvings. They were too intricate, too deliberate to be random. "This place wasn't just a mine," I said. "It was designed." "But for what?" "I don't know," Sarah asked. But before I could answer, the sound of footsteps returned. They were louder this time, closer. Whoever was following us was no longer trying to stay hidden. Sarah's hand tightened on her flashlight, and Ben instinctively moved closer to the wall, as if it could shield him from what was coming. "Lights off," I whispered. "No." We extinguished our lights, plunging the cavern into darkness. The sound of footsteps grew louder, echoing through the space. My heart pounded in my chest as I pressed my back against the cold stone, holding my breath. A beam of light cut through the darkness, scanning the room. Two figures entered, their silhouettes sharp against the glow of their flashlights. They moved deliberately, their voices low but sharp, their words indistinct. They stopped near the center of the room, their lights focused on the markings on the walls. One of them pulled something from his pocket, a device of some kind, and held it up to the carvings. The device emitted a faint hum, and the symbols on the walls seemed to shift under the light, as if responding to whatever signal it was emitting. "What are they doing?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing. Whoever these people were, they weren't smugglers or miners. They were here for something specific, something tied to this place. The two figures continued their work, oblivious to our presence. But then, as one of them adjusted the device, it emitted a sudden high, pitched whine that filled the chamber. The walls seemed to vibrate, the carvings glowing faintly under the light. And then, the ground beneath us shifted. The floor trembled, a deep, resonant rumble that sent a wave of panic through all of us. The two intruders shouted, their flashlights jerking wildly as they stumbled. Ben grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her back toward the corridor we'd come through. "Run," I shouted, my voice barely cutting through the chaos. We bolted, our footsteps echoing wildly as the tremors grew stronger. Behind us, I heard the intruders yelling, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of cracking stone. The corridor ahead was narrow, forcing us to move single file again. Sarah was in the lead now, Ben close behind her. I stayed at the rear, glancing back every few seconds, my flashlight bouncing off the jagged walls as we ran. The air grew colder, the metallic tang almost overpowering. The passage twisted and turned, each corner bringing the faint hope of escape. Finally, we emerged into another chamber, a smaller one with a low ceiling and a sloping floor. At the far end of the room was a faint glimmer of light, the exit. The exit. Sarah gasped, her voice filled with equal parts relief and desperation. We sprinted toward it, the ground still trembling beneath us, but just as we reached the opening, a deafening crash echoed from behind. I turned to see the corridor collapsing, the walls caving in as dust and debris filled the air. "Go," I shouted, pushing Ben and Sarah toward the exit. The passage led us outside into the biting cold of the open air. Snow swirled around us, the pale light of dawn casting long shadows over the rocky terrain. For a moment, none of us moved, too stunned by the sudden change. "We made it," Ben said, his voice shaky. "We're out." Sarah nodded, but her expression was grim. "And whoever was following us." I turned back toward the cave. The entrance was barely visible now, buried under a mass of rubble. Whoever those people were, they were either trapped inside or worse. We didn't stay to find out. The three of us made our way down the slope, our breaths forming clouds in the freezing air. Ben clutched the map tightly, his hands trembling, while Sarah kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting the shadows to follow us out. When we finally reached our base camp, the sight of our equipment was almost surreal. The radio antenna was still bent, but it was intact. I hurried to set it up, hoping against hope that we could make contact. To my relief, the signal went through. The voice on the other end crackled with static but was clear enough to understand. "This is Extraction Team Bravo. We're en route. Hold your position." Relief washed over me, but it was tempered by the weight of what we'd just experienced. As we waited for extraction, I pulled out the fragment of the map we'd found in the cave. The symbols and markings seemed meaningless now, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were part of something larger, something we'd only begun to uncover. "What do we tell them?" Ben asked, his voice low. "The truth," I said, "or as much of it as they'll believe." Sarah nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "And the rest?" I didn't answer. Some things were better left buried. When the helicopter finally arrived, we boarded in silence. As it lifted off, I looked back at the cave, its entrance now hidden beneath layers of rock and snow. The weight of what we'd seen, and what we hadn't, settled heavily on me. Somewhere deep in that mountain, secrets still lay hidden, secrets that someone had tried to protect, no matter the cost. As the helicopter carried us away, I couldn't help but wonder, had we escaped the danger or merely postponed it? For now, it didn't matter. We were alive, and sometimes, that's the only victory you need. As the mountain receded into the distance, I realized that survival wasn't just about escaping the cave. It was about carrying the weight of its secrets and the knowledge that some mysteries are better left unsolved. I'd been stuck in this tiny Alaskan town for almost a week, waiting for that perfect shot. The gig was simple enough: capture the rugged, untamed wilderness for some travel magazine. But something about these dense, endless forests and the eerie, silent nights started to get to me. I'd come here expecting some kind of serene beauty, but instead, it was just oppressive. Like the whole landscape was holding its breath, waiting for something big to happen. That's how I ended up in this small, dimly lit diner one evening, nursing a cup of black coffee that had long since gone cold. The place was practically empty, just a couple of locals scattered around, keeping to themselves. I was scrolling through the day's photos on my camera, trying to find anything that actually stood out, when the door creaked open, and this guy walked in. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with a grizzled beard, and this look that said he'd seen more than his fair share of rough winters. He slid into the booth across from me, nodding a quick hello before ordering his own coffee. We didn't speak for a few minutes, and honestly, I didn't mind. The silence felt natural, like it was just part of the environment. But then, just as I was about to get up and head back to my motel, he spoke. "You not from around here, are you?" he asked. His voice was low and gravelly, like he'd been smoking since he was 12. "No, just passing through. I'm a photographer," I replied, holding up my camera as if to prove it. "Taking some shots for a project." He nodded, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "Not much to see around here," he said. But there was something in his tone that made me think he didn't entirely believe that. "Unless you're looking for something specific." I shrugged. "I'm just trying to capture the landscape, the feel of the place. But honestly, I'm getting a little bored. There's only so many trees and mountains you can shoot before it all starts to look the same." He chuckled at that, a dry, almost humorless sound. "Yeah, I can see that. But there are things around here that aren't on any map. Places that aren't for tourists." Now, that got my attention. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Like what?" The man glanced around the diner, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. There wasn't anyone nearby, but he still leaned in a little closer. "Old military base," he said, almost in a whisper. "Out past the tree line near the old logging road. Been abandoned for decades. Most folks don't even know it's there, an abandoned base." I repeated, more out of disbelief than anything else. "What's it doing out here?" He shrugged. "They built it during the Cold War, back when they thought they needed a place out here, far away from prying eyes. Never really said what it was for, but they shut it down quick. Too quick, if you ask me." I could feel my curiosity sparking, even though I knew I should probably just let it go. "You ever been out there?" I asked. "Once ago. You didn't stay long," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Didn't like the feel of the place. Too quiet. Like it was waiting for something." I leaned back, trying to process what he was saying. There was a part of me that wanted to brush it off as just another local ghost story. But there was also a part of me, the part that had gotten me into trouble more than once, that couldn't resist the idea of exploring a place like that. "How do I get there?" I asked, trying to sound casual, even though I could feel my heart beating a little faster. He hesitated, and for a moment, I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then he sighed, as if resigning himself to the idea that I wasn't going to let it go. "You take the old dirt road out past Miller's Creek. Follow it for about 5 miles, then take the first right. You'll see a chain link fence. It's rusted and broken in places, but you can get through. Just be careful, Da." "Careful?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another long sip of his coffee, staring down into the dark liquid like it might hold the answers he needed. "There's things out there," he said finally. "Things you don't want to mess with. I'm not saying you'll find anything, but if you do, you'll wish you hadn't." The way he said it sent a chill down my spine, and I had to remind myself that I was a grown man, not some kid afraid of the dark. "I appreciate the warning," I said, trying to sound confident, "but I think I'll be fine." He just looked at me, his eyes dark and serious. "Maybe you will," he said quietly. "But just remember, some things are abandoned for a reason." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and finished my coffee. The conversation had left me feeling uneasy, but also more determined than ever. Whatever was out there, I wanted to see it for myself. I needed to see it for myself. I paid my bill and left the diner, stepping out into the cold night air. The streets were quiet, and the sky was clear, the stars shining like tiny pinpricks of light against the darkness. I stood there for a moment, thinking about what the man had said, and then I made up my mind. I was going to check out that base. I spent the rest of the evening doing a little research, trying to find anything I could about the place. But there was almost nothing. A few mentions of a base that had been operational during the 1960s, but no details, no photos, nothing to explain why it had been shut down so abruptly. It was like someone had gone out of their way to erase any trace of it. That only made me more curious. The next morning, I packed up my camera gear, a flashlight, and a few other essentials. I wasn't planning on staying long, just long enough to get a few shots and satisfy my curiosity. I figured I'd be in and out in a couple of hours, tops. The drive out there was longer than I expected. The old dirt road was rough, barely more than a trail in some places, and it twisted and turned through the dense forest, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. It felt like I was driving deeper and deeper into a place where I didn't belong, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, there was nothing there. After about an hour, I saw the fence. It was just like the man had described, rusted, sagging in places, with sections that had been broken or cut away. I pulled up to the gate, which hung open on one hinge, and got out of the car. There was a cold breeze blowing, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and pine, and for a moment, I almost thought about turning back. But then I saw the base. It was bigger than I expected, a collection of squat, concrete buildings with peeling paint and broken windows. There were no signs, no markings, nothing to indicate what it had been used for. Just rows of dark, empty windows staring back at me like eyes, watching my every move. I took a deep breath, grabbed my camera, and stepped through the gate. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in patches of dead grass and mud. I could see the remains of old equipment, scattered around rusted metal pipes, broken crates, and the occasional piece of machinery that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. It was eerie, but also strangely fascinating, like walking through a place that had been forgotten by time. I started taking photos, trying to capture the bleak, desolate beauty of the place. But the further I went, the more I felt like I was intruding on something. It was like the air was getting colder, thicker, as if the base was trying to push me away. I was about to turn back when I saw the entrance to one of the buildings. It was partially open, the door hanging off its hinges, and I could see a staircase leading down into darkness. I knew I shouldn't go down there. I knew it was probably a bad idea, but I also knew that if I didn't, I'd always wonder what was down there. So I took a deep breath, turned on my flashlight, and stepped inside. The air was colder down there, almost freezing, and it smelled faintly of damp concrete and something else I couldn't quite place. I could hear my footsteps echoing off the walls, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something down there with me, just out of sight, waiting. But I kept going, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, guiding me deeper into the belly of the base. I didn't know what I was expecting to find, but I had a feeling that whatever it was, it wasn't going to be good. I barely slept that night. My mind was racing with images of the abandoned base and what could possibly be hidden there. As the morning light crept through the thin curtains of my motel room, I felt an uneasy excitement pushing me forward. This was what I lived for, the chance to uncover something forgotten, something no one else had dared to explore. After a quick breakfast that I barely tasted, I packed my gear. My camera, flashlight, and extra batteries were non-negotiables. I threw in a couple of energy bars, bottled water, and a small first aid kit more out of habit than expectation of needing them. A sense of anticipation buzzed in the back of my mind, though I told myself it was just the thrill of a new discovery. As I drove out of town, following Dan's directions, I'd managed to remember his name had to be important, right? The scenery began to shift. The paved road gave way to gravel, and eventually I found myself on a narrow dirt road that twisted and turned through dense trees. The forest felt like it was closing in on me, thick with towering pines and spruces that blocked out most of the sky. Every now and then, I caught glimpses of old, rusted signs, half buried in undergrowth, remnants of what might have once been warnings, but the words had faded long ago, leaving nothing but weathered metal. The road itself was rough, and I had to keep both the hands on the wheel to avoid potholes and rocks. It felt like I was driving deeper into a place that didn't want to be found, where nature had reclaimed everything. The radio lost its signal about 10 miles back, and my phone had no reception for even longer. I was completely cut off. That was when I first noticed it, the feeling that something was off. It wasn't the road or the isolation. I was used to that. No, This was something different, a subtle but persistent sensation that I was being watched. I caught myself glancing into the rearview mirror more often than usual, expecting to see what? I didn't know. But each time, there was nothing. Just the road behind me, stretching back into the dense, suffocating trees. I shook it off, focusing on the task ahead. This was just another abandoned place, nothing more. But still, the sensation lingered, gnawing at me as the road narrowed, forcing me to slow down. After nearly an hour of driving, I saw it, the fence. It loomed ahead, just as Dan had described, sagging and rusted with age. The chain link barrier was more of a suggestion than a defense now, with large sections broken or missing altogether. The gate itself hung open, one hinge completely gone, the other barely holding on. It was an entrance, but it felt more like a mouth, waiting to swallow me whole. I parked the car just outside the fence and stepped out. The air was colder here, despite the bright midday sun filtering through the trees. A biting wind cut through my jacket, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and metal. I stood still for a moment, taking it all in. The base was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no wind in the trees, just an oppressive silence that felt unnatural. I took a deep breath, grabbed my camera, and headed toward the gate. The gravel crunched under my boots, each step echoing louder than it should have in the dead air. I passed through the gate, my eyes scanning the buildings ahead. They were larger than I had expected, long, low structures with concrete walls, the paint peeling away in long strips. Windows were shattered, doors hung open, and the once formidable military installation now looked like a skeleton, picked clean by time and decay. I started snapping photos, capturing the stark desolation. I had to admit, the place had a strange kind of beauty. The decay, the silence. It was haunting, and I knew the photos would turn out amazing. But even as I focused on my work, I couldn't shake the growing sense that something wasn't right. It felt like the base was watching me, its empty windows like hollow eyes, tracking my every move. The path between the buildings was littered with debris. Rusted barrels, broken glass, pieces of equipment too far gone to recognize. I could see where nature had begun to take over, with vines creeping up the walls and grass growing through the cracks in the pavement. As I moved deeper into the base, the wind picked up, whistling through the broken windows and creating an eerie, almost mournful sound. After a while, I found myself standing in front of a larger building. Its entrance was partially obscured by a collapsed awning, but the door was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. My curiosity got the better of me. I raised my flashlight and stepped inside. The air inside was cold, much colder than outside, and carried a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a long corridor lined with old offices. The floor was covered in dust and debris, and I could see signs that the place had been abandoned in a hurry. Chairs were tipped over, papers scattered across the floor, and a few old military jackets still hung on hooks by the doors. I took a few more photos, but the unease was starting to creep back in. Something about the place felt wrong, like it had been frozen in time. It wasn't just the abandoned equipment or the emptiness. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. As I moved further down the hallway, I began to hear faint noises. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sounds grew more distinct, a soft clanking, like metal against metal, and something else, a rustling, as if something was moving just out of sight. I stopped, straining to listen, but the sound stopped too. The silence rushed back in, heavy and oppressive. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just old pipes settling, or maybe a raccoon scurrying through the debris. Still, my heart was pounding a little faster now, and I found myself gripping the flashlight tighter as I continued down the hallway. At the far end of the corridor, I found a door that was slightly ajar. I hesitated, feeling a sudden reluctance to go any further, but the pull of discovery was too strong. I nudged the door open and stepped inside. The room was small, with bare concrete walls and a control panel against one wall. It looked like some kind of operations center, with switches and dials, though most of them were covered in dust and grime. I approached the panel, wiping away the dust with my sleeve, and saw that some of the switches were still functional. One in particular caught my eye, a large, red switch in the center of the panel. Against my better judgment, I flipped it. A low hum filled the air, followed by the faint flicker of lights down the hallway. For a brief moment, the entire building seemed to come alive, the lights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. And then, just as quickly, they flickered out again, leaving only the dim beam of my flashlight. But that wasn't the worst part. From somewhere deep in the base, beyond the reach of the flashlight, I heard a sound, faint at first but unmistakable: footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing off the walls. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were distant, but they were coming closer. And there was something off about them. They didn't sound like the footsteps of an animal, or even another person. They were too slow, too heavy, like something was dragging itself through the dark. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just the building settling. Maybe it was an animal, bigger than I thought. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. Something was down here, something that shouldn't be. I backed away from the control panel, my eyes darting to the door. I needed to get out of there fast. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening crash. I lunged for the handle, my hands shaking as I tried to yank it open, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through me. I was trapped. And those footsteps, they were getting closer. I could hear them now, clearer than before, heavy, deliberate, slow, like something was taking its time, enjoying the chase. I had to think. I had to get out. My mind raced, scanning the room for another exit, but there was nothing. Just bare walls and that cursed control panel. My pulse pounded in my ears as I braced myself against the door, trying to calm my breathing. And then the footsteps stopped right outside the door. I didn't dare move. I didn't even breathe. I just stood there, pressed against the cold concrete, listening to the deafening silence that had replaced the footsteps. For a long moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the crushing weight of fear and the knowledge that something was waiting on the other side of that door. And then, slowly, the handle began to turn. The moment the handle began to turn, my entire body went rigid. I could feel my pulse throbbing in my ears, drowning out the silence. My eyes were glued to the door, and I was torn between bolting and freezing in place, praying that whatever was on the other side would change its mind and leave. But I knew better. Nothing that had come this far was going to walk away now. The door creaked open just a crack. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the gap, but the darkness swallowed everything. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence, and then I heard it, a faint, rasping breath, like someone struggling to inhale through a throat clogged with dust. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, its beam shaking slightly as I raised it. The door stopped moving. My heart hammered, daring me to do something, anything. I took a step back, my mind racing through options that all seemed equally terrible. I couldn't stay in the room, it felt like a trap. But leaving meant facing whatever was out there. And it was definitely still there. I could hear it now, a soft, dragging shuffle that grew louder with each second. In a burst of panic, I spun around, looking for another way out. My eyes landed on a vent cover near the floor. It was small, but if I could loosen it, I might be able to squeeze through. Desperate, I dropped to my knees and began to pry at the screws, my hands trembling. Each second felt like an eternity, the scraping of metal echoing louder than I thought possible. Just as I managed to loosen one screw, the door creaked open a little further. I froze, glancing over my shoulder. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something, a shadow, elongated and distorted, creeping across the floor toward me. I didn't wait to see more. I yanked harder at the vent cover, finally pulling it free and pushing it aside. I could hear the footsteps now, closer and clearer, accompanied by that same labored breathing. It was moving slowly, but steadily, as if it had all the time in the world. I wriggled into the vent, forcing my shoulders through the narrow opening, my flashlight clenched between my teeth. The metal edges scraped against my sides, but I ignored the pain and kept going, inch by inch. As soon as I was fully inside, I pushed the vent cover back into place, leaving it slightly ajar so I could see out. The vent was cramped, and the air was stale, but it felt safer than that room. I had to remind myself to breathe quietly, to keep my nerves in check. Through the tiny opening, I saw the door swing open fully. My flashlight's beam flickered across the floor, but the thing standing there was hidden in the shadows, just out of sight. I could still hear it breathing, a horrible, wheezing sound that made my skin crawl. Then, it took a step forward, dragging its feet across the floor, and the flashlight beam flickered wildly, as if it sensed the presence. I held my breath, waiting. The thing moved closer, and for a split second I saw it. Just a glimpse. It was hunched, almost humanoid, with limbs that didn't seem to bend the way they should. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and I could make out patches where it looked torn, hanging off like old, peeling wallpaper. But its face, that was the worst part. I couldn't see it clearly, but there was something wrong, something that didn't belong. Eyes that seemed too dark, too deep, like they were pulling the light into them and swallowing it whole. It stopped near the control panel, just inches away from the vent. I could hear its breaths, ragged and uneven, like it was struggling to keep itself upright. For a moment, it stood still, as if trying to figure out where I had gone. My hands shook, and I had to press them against the sides of the vent to stop the rattling. The urge to move, to run, was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay still. If it hadn't seen me yet, I didn't want to give it a reason to start looking. The creature's head tilted, almost as if it was listening for something. Then, without warning, it turned and shuffled back toward the doorway, disappearing into the dark hallway. I waited, listening to the creature's footsteps fade away. But even when I could no longer hear them, I didn't move. I couldn't risk it. Not yet. When I finally felt like I could breathe again, I slid the vent cover aside and crawled out, careful not to make a sound. The room felt colder, and the air was heavy, like it was weighing me down. I had to get out of there, but I also needed answers. I looked around, my eyes settling on the control panel. If that thing had been so interested in it, maybe it was important. Maybe it held some clue to what was going on. I approached it slowly, half expecting the creature to burst back in at any moment. The switches and dials were old, covered in grime, but some were labeled. My eyes scanned over them, and I noticed one switch that was different from the rest. It was marked with a word that made my blood run cold: containment. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to just leave. But my curiosity wouldn't let me. What were they trying to contain? Was it that thing I had seen? Or was there something worse lurking in the shadows of this place? Against all reason, I flipped the switch. The building shuddered, and for a moment, I thought I had made a terrible mistake. Then a low, mechanical hum filled the air, and the lights flickered on, illuminating a set of screens mounted above the panel. At first, they only displayed static, but slowly, one by one, the screens cleared, showing live feeds from different parts of the base. I could see dark, empty hallways, rooms filled with decaying equipment, and storage areas littered with debris. But there was one screen that made my stomach drop. It showed a long, narrow corridor lined with thick metal doors, each one secured with heavy locks. Something was moving in the corridor, pacing back and forth, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It was the same creature I had seen, but now I could see there were others. 3, maybe 4, all moving slowly, aimlessly, like they were waiting for something. Then the screen flickered again, and a message appeared, the same one I had seen earlier, but with an added line: "You shouldn't be here. Leave before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted for the door, my heart racing. The hallway outside was empty, but I could still hear faint echoes, those same dragging footsteps, now joined by others, as if the creatures were starting to move, converging on one place. I ran, my boots thudding against the concrete floor, not caring if they heard me anymore. I had to find the exit, and fast. But as I rounded a corner, I skidded to a stop. The hallway I had come through earlier was different now, like it had been rearranged. Doors that had been on the left were now on the right, and there was no sign of the entrance I had used to get in. Panic set in, and I spun around, trying to orient myself. It was as if the building itself was changing, twisting into a maze designed to keep me from finding my way out. I forced myself to breathe, to think. There had to be a way. There was always a way. In the distance, I heard the sound of metal clanging, followed by a low, guttural growl. The creatures were getting closer, and I didn't have time to figure out what was happening. I picked a direction and started running, hoping it would lead me somewhere, anywhere that wasn't here. As I sprinted down the unfamiliar hallway, the lights overhead began to flicker, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. I could see glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, but I didn't dare stop to look. I knew that if I did, I might not have the strength to keep going. Finally, I saw a heavy, rusted door at the end of the corridor, slightly ajar, with a sliver of light spilling out from the other side. I didn't care where it led. I just needed to get out. I charged toward it, throwing my shoulder against the metal, and stumbled through. In the center of the room was a large glass chamber. My heart skipped a beat when I saw it. The glass was cracked and foggy, but I could make out shapes inside of wires, tubing, and something else. I approached it slowly, my breath fogging up the glass as I peered inside. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. The thing inside was tangled in a mess of cables, its limbs limp and twisted. It looked vaguely humanoid, but its proportions were all wrong. Its arms too long, its torso too thin, and its skin pale and stretched tight over its frame. The face was obscured, but I could see something moving beneath the skin, as if something was alive inside, trying to push its way out. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting with nausea. What the hell was this place? The old control logs I'd seen on the upper floors flashed through my mind. Words like harness and experiments, jumbling together. Whatever they had been doing here, it hadn't just gone wrong, it had gone horribly, nightmarishly wrong. I heard a noise behind me, and I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of movement. Something darted across the floor, too fast for me to see clearly. My pulse spiked as I scanned the room, trying to find whatever had just moved, but the shadows were too thick, and the beam of light was too narrow. Then, a low, mechanical hum filled the air, and the lights flickered to life. Dim, yellowish bulbs cast a sickly glow across the room, revealing more of the machinery in the chamber. My flashlight wasn't needed anymore, but I didn't turn it off. I felt better with it on, like it was a shield against whatever was lurking in the dark corners. As I backed away, I noticed a small desk tucked against the far wall. It was cluttered with old notebooks, papers, and a thick file that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed the file, flipping it open. The pages were covered in technical jargon, most of which made no sense to me, but there were photos, blurry, black and white images of the base's construction, diagrams of the underground chambers, and a few pictures of the experiments. One of the photos showed the chamber from a different angle, and I saw what was inside more clearly. It was the same thing I had seen, only back then. It hadn't been so emaciated. It looked human almost, but not quite. Its eyes were wide and dark, staring straight at the camera, and its mouth was open, as if it was screaming. Another photo showed a team of scientists standing around the chamber, their faces blank, their postures rigid. I flipped to the next page, and my breath caught. A handwritten note, scrawled hastily across the paper, read experiment compromised. Attempted control failed. Do not release under any circumstances. I dropped the file, the papers scattering across the floor. It all started to make sense, but in the worst way possible. They had tried to control something they didn't understand, something they couldn't keep contained. And now, decades later, it was still down here, still waiting. A loud crash jolted me out of my thoughts, and I whipped around to see the glass chamber had shifted, tilting slightly on its base. The thing inside twitched, its limbs jerking as if waking from a long sleep. I backed away, my eyes locked on the chamber, but I knew I had to move fast. Whatever they had trapped here, it wasn't going to stay trapped much longer. I bolted for the ladder, my mind racing as I started to climb. I heard a faint scraping noise below, followed by a low, guttural growl. I glanced down and saw the thing, its eyes open now, glinting in the dim light as it moved. Its limbs, still tangled in wires, it was trying to pull itself free, and it was succeeding. Panic gripped me, and I climbed faster, ignoring the pain in my hands as they scraped against the metal rungs. I could still hear the growling below me, louder and more desperate. My legs burned, but I forced myself to keep going, knowing that if I stopped, I might not get another chance. I reached the top of the ladder and threw the hatch open, scrambling out and slamming it shut behind me. I grabbed the chain and wrapped it around the latch, yanking it tight. It wasn't much, but it would have to hold. I took a step back, my chest heaving, and listened. The growling had stopped, but I could still hear movement, slow, deliberate, as if it was testing the barrier. I didn't wait to find out if it could break through. I turned and ran, sprinting down the hallway, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I searched for an exit. The base felt different now, more alive, as if it was reacting to what I had done. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I could hear faint whispers echoing through the corridors. Voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stumbled upon a stairwell, the sign above it barely legible, but I didn't care. I took the stairs two at a time, desperate to get back to the surface. As I reached the top, I heard a loud metallic groan, followed by the crash of something heavy falling below. I didn't look back, I just ran, pushing through the door and out into the cold, open air. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the base. I could see my car in the distance, parked just outside the fence. It felt impossibly far away, but I forced myself to keep running, every step bringing me closer. I didn't dare stop until I was inside, slamming the door shut and jamming the keys into the ignition. The engine sputtered for a moment, then roared to life. I floored the gas, tearing out of there without a second thought. As I sped down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the base shrinking in the distance, its dark, empty windows staring back at me unblinking. But just before the road turned, taking the base out of sight, I saw something. A light flickered on, just for a moment, in one of the upper windows, and I thought I could make out a figure standing there, watching me. And then, just as quickly, it was gone. The drive back to town was a blur. Even with the gas pedal pushed to the floor, it felt like I wasn't moving fast enough, like the road stretched longer and darker with every second. My hands were shaking, gripping the steering wheel too tightly, but I couldn't loosen my grip. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something darting between the trees, chasing me. But the road behind me was empty, just an endless stretch of dark, twisting forest. When I finally pulled into the motel parking lot, I slumped back in my seat, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still pounding, and my mind replayed everything I had seen: those dark, empty corridors, the strange experiment trapped in the chamber, and the twisted figure that had almost found me in the control room. I felt sick, but there was a stubborn part of me that couldn't let go, that needed to know more. I knew I should drive away, forget everything, and never come back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. I tried to sleep that night, but my dreams were restless and fragmented, filled with distorted faces and the sound of slow, dragging footsteps echoing through empty halls. When I woke up, I felt more exhausted than before. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it all. But I knew I hadn't. I had been there. I had seen it. The thought of leaving town, of putting as much distance as possible between myself and that base, was tempting. But it wasn't enough. Whatever had been left behind there, it had been waiting. And now it felt like it was awake. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had started something that wouldn't just stay buried underground. I spent the morning pacing my room, trying to figure out what to do. My mind kept going back to Dan, the man who had sent me there in the first place. The way he had spoken, the way he had almost warned me but hadn't said enough. It didn't sit right. He knew more than he had let on, and I needed to talk to him again. I needed answers. I drove to the diner, hoping to find him there. But it was empty, except for a couple of locals who glanced up when I walked in. I scanned the room, my heart sinking when I didn't see his familiar, grizzled face. I ordered a coffee and sat down, thinking maybe he'd show up if I waited long enough. But an hour passed, and there was still no sign of him. I was just about to give up when I heard the door creak open behind me. I turned expecting to see Dan, but instead, it was a waitress I hadn't seen before. She looked at me, then at the empty booth I had been staring at, and walked over. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, her voice polite but distant. "No, I'm good. I was just wondering, you haven't seen a guy named Dan around here, have you? Older, kind of scruffy, always sits in that booth by the window." She frowned, shaking her head. "I've been working here a few years, and I don't know anyone named Dan. Are you sure you have the right place?" I blinked, taken aback. "Yeah, I'm sure. I talked to him just a couple of days ago, right here. He told me about that old base out past Miller's Creek." The waitress's expression changed slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Sat place. Look, I don't know what you're talking about, but if I were you, I'd forget you ever heard of it. No good comes from poking around out there." The way she said it reminded me of Dan, the same careful avoidance, the same hint of fear. But this time, I couldn't just let it go. What do you know about it? I asked, leaning forward. Why was it abandoned? She hesitated, glancing around like she was afraid someone might overhear. Then she sighed. Look, I don't know much, okay? Just bits and pieces. Rumors from people who've been around long enough. They say it was some kind of research facility, but not the kind they talk about in the papers. Whatever they were doing out there, it wasn't meant to see the light of day. And when things went wrong, they buried it. They made sure no one would come looking. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. But why hasn't anyone tried to clear it out? Shut it down for good? Because it's easier to forget, she said simply. And most people around here are smart enough to leave it alone. Whatever is out there, it's still there for a reason. I thanked her and left the diner, but her words stuck with me. Easier to forget. Maybe that's what everyone had been doing, pretending the base didn't exist, like they could erase it from memory, just by not talking about it. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't do the same. I needed to go back. I don't know what drove me to make that decision. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that there was something I had missed, something important. Or maybe it was just stubbornness, a need to finish what I had started. Whatever it was, it led me back to the base, back to the place I had sworn I would never see again. The drive felt different this time. The road seemed longer, the trees darker, and the air colder. It was as if the forest knew I was coming back, and it wasn't happy about it. When I reached the gate, I hesitated, my hand on the steering wheel, staring at the rusted metal fence. Part of me wanted to turn around, drive until I couldn't see the base anymore. But I knew that wasn't an option. Not now. I parked the car and got out, my footsteps crunching on the gravel as I approached the gate. It creaked open, just like before, and I stepped inside, my heart pounding. The buildings looked the same, still crumbling and silent, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't been there last time. I felt like I was walking into a trap. I made my way back to the building with the control room, the one where I had seen the creatures on the monitor. I didn't want to go back inside, but I had to. I had to see if there was anything else, any clue I had missed. The door was still open, swinging gently in the wind, and I slipped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The control room was just as I had left it. The monitors dark and silent, the control panel still coated in dust. I approached it slowly, half expecting the screens to flicker on again, but they stayed dark. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, relief mixing with unease. I hadn't seen any of the creatures on my way in, but I could feel them. I knew they were still here, somewhere watching. I scanned the room, looking for anything I hadn't noticed before. There was a desk pushed up against the wall, covered in more papers, and I sifted through them, hoping to find something, anything that would explain what had happened here. Most of it was useless, pages of technical jargon that meant nothing to me. But then I found a journal, its cover worn and faded. I flipped it open and my breath caught. The first few pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, detailing the early stages of the experiments, the excitement and hope that had driven the researchers. But as I read on, The writing grew messier, the sentences more fragmented. Words like containment breach and uncontrollable jumped out at me, and I felt a knot form in my stomach. I turned to the last page, and my blood ran cold. The handwriting was barely legible, The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled hastily across the paper. We were wrong. It's not a subject, it's a signal, and it's calling to them. We can't stop it. If anyone finds this, the sentence cut off, the pen dragging across the page as if it had been yanked away. I dropped the journal, my hands shaking, and took a step back. A signal. I didn't understand, but I didn't have time to think. The air was getting colder, and I could hear something, a faint, rhythmic sound, like a heartbeat, pulsing through the walls. I turned my flashlight, sweeping it across the room, and that's when I saw it. The monitor at the far end of the room flickered, then burst to life, showing the same dark corridor I had seen before. Only this time, the metal doors were open, and the hallway was empty. I couldn't breathe. They were out. Whatever was down there, whatever they had been trying to contain, it was loose. And it wasn't just one anymore. I could hear the sound growing louder, like a drumbeat echoing through the bass, and I knew I had to get out. I bolted for the door, my flashlight swinging wildly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. But as I reached the hallway, I froze. Something was blocking the exit. A dark, twisted shape that stood in the doorway, its eyes glinting in the dim light. I took a step back, my heart hammering, and it moved slowly, its limbs jerking unnaturally, like it was struggling to remember how to walk. For a moment we just stared at each other, and I felt like I was looking at something that wasn't meant to be seen, something that existed outside of everything I understood. Then it tilted its head, and I heard a sound, a low, distorted hum that vibrated through the air, sending chills down my spine. It was the signal, the thing that the journal had warned about, and it was calling them. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away. The base felt like it was collapsing around me, the walls twisting and closing in, and I could hear that hum, growing louder, echoing in my head, pulling me back. I had to keep running. I had to get out before it was too late. As I stumbled through the darkness, I realized the truth. The base wasn't just hiding something, it was a beacon, and I had been the one to light it. The hum echoed in my ears as I stumbled through the darkened corridors, my legs heavy and my breathing ragged. The base felt alive now, like it was breathing around me, pulsing with an energy I didn't understand. I was disoriented, barely able to tell which way I was going, but I knew I had to get out. The flickering lights cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, and every step I took felt like it might be my last. I pushed through a set of heavy doors, half expecting them to be locked, but they swung open easily. I was in another long hallway, lined with rooms that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. The rhythmic, droning hum was louder here, vibrating through the floor, and I felt it deep in my bones. I had to press on. I had to find a way out before whatever was down there caught up to me. But then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. At the end of the hallway, a light was on. It was the only one shining, bright and steady, unlike the flickering bulbs that had lit my path so far. I hesitated, a thousand thoughts racing through my mind. It could be a way out, or it could be a trap. Either way, I was out of options. I moved toward the light, my footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. As I got closer, I noticed that the door was slightly open, and inside, I could make out the faint hum of machinery. I pushed the door open and stepped inside, my heart pounding, unsure of what I'd find. The room was different from the rest of the base. It was clean, almost sterile, and the hum was deafening now, like the steady drone of an engine. In the center of the room was a massive circular console, covered in switches, dials, and monitors. But what caught my attention was the screen directly in front of me. It was showing a live feed of the corridor I had just come through. And there, on the screen, was me. I stared at it, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It was a clear image, not grainy or distorted like the other feeds. I could see myself standing in the doorway, looking back at the screen. My mouth was open, my face pale and covered in sweat. I turned around, half expecting to see a camera aimed at me, but there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out into the darkness. I turned back to the screen, and that's when I saw it. Movement behind me. I whipped around, but the hallway was still empty. Yet, on the monitor, I could see it clearly, a dark, distorted figure, slowly creeping up behind where I had been standing just moments ago. It moved in and out of the shadows, its form flickering like static, but its intent was clear. It was following me. My stomach twisted, and I fought the urge to bolt. Running wouldn't help. I needed to understand what was happening, why this place felt like a trap designed just for me. I scanned the console, my eyes darting over the buttons and switches, trying to find something, anything that would make sense of this nightmare. Then I saw it, a small, worn-out notebook wedged between two panels. I grabbed it and flipped it open, my hands shaking. The pages were filled with diagrams, notes, and messy handwriting. It was all technical, most of it incomprehensible, but there were phrases that stood out, phrases that made my blood run cold. Signal interference, broadcast disruption, psychological manipulation, and then one line underlined repeatedly, as if whoever wrote it wanted to make sure it was understood. It's not them, it's us. I didn't know what it meant, but I could feel the truth of it sinking into my gut. Whatever had been going on here, it wasn't about containing something. It was about controlling it, using it. They had found a way to send out a signal, one that could manipulate the mind, make you see things that weren't there, hear things that weren't real. And I had been caught in it, tangled up in a web of illusions and fear. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden burst of static, and I looked up at the screen. The dark figure was gone, but the image was still there, flickering slightly. Then the screen went black, and a new message appeared, in the same font as before: "You are the signal." I stepped back, the notebook slipping from my hands. It didn't make any sense, but at the same time, it explained everything. The visions, the noises, even Dan. He had been part of it, guiding me here, drawing me in. But why? I had to get out. I had to get out before I lost myself completely to whatever this was. I ran back into the hallway, not caring about the noise I made. I could still hear the hum, louder now, almost like it was laughing at me, mocking my fear. The walls seemed to pulse with it, and I could feel it in my head, like a headache that wouldn't stop. But I kept running, forcing myself to focus on the way out. The exit was just ahead. I could see the dim light of the sky outside, a sliver of hope in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain in my legs, the burn in my lungs. I was almost there, almost. I crashed through the door and stumbled outside, collapsing on the cold, damp ground. The sky was overcast, dark clouds swirling overhead, but it felt like freedom. I lay there, gasping for breath, feeling the wind on my face, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I heard it. The hum, not coming from the base, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere, inside me. I sat up, my head spinning, and realized with a sickening dread that it hadn't stopped. It had never stopped. It was inside my mind, and it wasn't going away. I scrambled to my feet, staggering toward my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life, and I tore out of there, not looking back. But as I drove, the hum followed me, a low, steady drone that I couldn't escape. I drove for hours, trying to get as far from that place as possible. But it didn't matter. No matter how far I went, I could still hear it, still feel it vibrating through my skull. It was like a part of me now, and I couldn't turn it off. I don't remember how I made it back to the motel. I must have passed out at some point, because when I opened my eyes, I was slumped over the steering wheel, parked outside my room. The hum was still there, faint but persistent, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I stumbled out of the car, my legs barely able to hold me up, and made my way to the room. Inside, I collapsed onto the bed, the world spinning around me. I reached for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But there was no signal, just the hum, growing louder, filling my head until I thought it would split open. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a voice, clear and cold, whispering things I didn't want to hear, things I couldn't ignore. And I knew, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't going to stop. I was the signal. I had been all along. And now it was using me, broadcasting through me, spreading itself. Whatever they had done at that base, they had succeeded. The signal wasn't just a machine, it was a consciousness, something that could live inside you, feed off your thoughts, and turn your mind into its own. The next morning, I checked out of the motel, barely aware of what I was doing. I drove out of town, not knowing where I was going, just trying to get away. But I knew deep down that there was no escape. The signal had me now, and it wasn't going to let go. And as I drove, the hum grew louder, and I could see them, dark, flickering shapes moving in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. They were waiting, watching, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that they were real as the signal inside me. I had brought them out, and now they were free. I don't know how this ends. Maybe it never does. Maybe the signal will keep spreading until there's nothing left but the hum, until we're all just echoes in its endless, empty frequency. But if you're reading this, if you found this, then please don't come looking for me. Don't try to find the base. Some things are abandoned for a reason, and whatever you do, don't listen to the signal.